The fire is almost gone, and beyond it the dark feels crowded. Not empty, not silent. Crowded. Somewhere out there, beyond the weak ring of light, Ice Age wind moves through dry grass and low pines, and something large shifts its weight in the black. A horse herd passed here earlier. Wolves may be following. Hyenas may be closer than they sound. Above it all hangs a sky so immense and so sharp with stars that it hardly seems like a ceiling at all. It looks more like a second wilderness opening overhead, cold and unreachable, filled with movements no one can control. The moon swells and thins, meteors cut across the night without warning. Storms arrive from nowhere. People sleep, wake, dream, sicken, recover, bleed, age, and disappear into the ground. And in this world, long before writing, before temples, before priesthoods, before any god receives a carved face or a proper name, the first pieces of the mystery are already in place. It is tempting to imagine that gods begin dramatically with a thunderbolt, a revelation, a sacred mountain, a king claiming heaven has chosen him. But those are late scenes painted after countless earlier generations have already lived inside a stranger and more uncertain relationship with the world. The invention of gods, if that is even the right word, does not happen in a single place or at a single moment. No hand lifts on one afternoon and creates the divine. No surviving voice says, "Here is the first god and here is why we made it." What survives in the record suggests something slower, deeper, and far more human. Not a sudden idea, but a gradual change in how people understand agency, death memory, danger, and the invisible causes behind visible events. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The question sounds simple at first. When did humans invent gods? Yet the moment it is asked seriously, the ground begins to shift. What counts as a god is a spirit. A god is an ancestor. A god is a powerful animal in a cave. Painting a god or something more fluid and older than that word allows. Does religion begin with fear, with grief, with imagination, with dreams, with social control, with agriculture, with storytelling, or with the structure of the human brain itself? Scholars still debate all of this, and the evidence remains incomplete. The farther back the search goes, the less language survives to guide it. Stone tools survive, bones survive, pigments survive, buildings sometimes survive, but thoughts vanish easily, meanings vanish even faster. And yet the silence of prehistory is not complete. It never is. Human beings leave traces not only of what they eat and build, but of what they notice, what they repeat, what they treat differently from ordinary things. A buried child with unusual objects, a cave wall covered in animals painted far beyond the reach of sunlight, a skull handled long after death, a place returned to again and again for reasons that do not look practical. These fragments are small, but they are enough to suggest that early humans do not move through their world as mere opportunists reacting only to hunger and weather. They interpret, they remember, they attach importance. They seem to sense very early that the world contains presences and meanings not visible at first glance. That may be the true beginning of the story, not gods as personalities on high, but minds that refuse to accept the world as only surfaces and accidents. A branch cracks in the forest, and attention leaps toward intention. Something caused that. Something wanted that. A face appears in the rock. A voice comes in a dream from someone already dead. A child resembles a grandparent too closely. A sudden illness follows a broken taboo. A hunt succeeds after a ritual gesture and fails after it is neglected. Modern humans are still built to notice pattern motive and hidden agency with extraordinary speed because for most of our species' history, it is safer to assume a rustle in the grass is an animal, than to coolly calculate probabilities and be eaten while doing it. Some anthropologists and cognitive scientists argue that this habit of mind becomes one of the deep roots of religion. Not religion by itself and not gods fully formed, but a readiness to sense purposeful forces behind uncertain events. In that sense, the origins of gods may lie partly in a feature of the human nervous system. The mind over-detects agency. It guesses that things happen because someone somewhere intended them. This is useful in a dangerous world. It is also fertile ground for the supernatural. If thunder feels like action rather than mechanism, if dreams feel like travel rather than neural activity, if death feels like departure rather than cessation, then the unseen quickly becomes crowded. Not with abstract theology at first, but with presences, forces, watchers, ancestors, animal powers, owners of places, voices in the dark. But that explanation alone is too thin. Human beings do not invent enduring sacred worlds simply because they are nervous pattern seekers. Fear matters, but fear does not build ritual by itself. To understand why gods eventually appear, it helps to begin not with belief as a doctrine, but with experience. Early humans live in a world of astonishing uncertainty. A landscape can feed a group for weeks and then fail them. Rivers shift, herds vanish, winters deepen, children die suddenly. Skilled hunters make obvious mistakes and survive them while others do everything right and do not return. The line between life and death is narrow, and chance must have felt unbearable if left entirely unexplained. So people explain, or perhaps more accurately, they narrate. They place events into stories large enough to hold them. This matters because humans are not simply intelligent animals. They are narrative animals. They do not endure reality as a sequence of disconnected blows. They connect what happens. They remember who offended whom. They recall what was done before the hunt, what was said before the birth, what bird appeared before the storm. Meaning becomes a survival tool of its own. A world interpreted is easier to inhabit than a world of pure randomness. There is another element here, quieter but just as important, the strange fact that humans know they are going to die. Not in the vague biological way other creatures may sense danger or loss, but in the cumulative, imaginative way that turns mortality into a permanent mental presence. Once a species can picture tomorrow in detail, it can picture its own absence as well. Once it can dream vividly, it can also misunderstand dreams vividly. Once it can remember the dead, it can continue to feel them near. The dead do not vanish cleanly from social life. They remain in memory, in fear, in guilt, in longing. A person who was once fully present now appears in sleep in resemblance, in the habits of the living, in places where they used to sit, in tools they once held. For a mind shaped to detect agency, death does not necessarily look like extinction. It can look like withdrawal, departure, transformation, presence without a body. No single explanation fully accounts for this, because the origins of gods likely draw from many streams at once. The fear of predators is one stream, dreams are another, death is another, so is wonder. It would be a mistake to reduce early belief to terror alone, as if ancient people crouch through prehistory, inventing religion merely because they are afraid of storms. They are also astonished. Anyone living close to seasonal migration moon cycles, birth decay, and the sheer scale of the night sky would encounter not just danger but recurring grandeur. There is order in the heavens and wildness on the ground. There is blood and blossom, catastrophe and return. The world can kill, but it can also overwhelm with beauty, pattern and abundance. Or may be just as ancient as fear. In many religious traditions much later, the sacred remains bound to both feelings at once dread and fascination, terror and attraction, the sense that something greater than ordinary life is close. This is one reason the oldest religious impulses may not look very much like later religion at all. There may be no commandments yet, no sacred books, no official myths in stable form. Instead, there are practices, gestures, prohibitions, repeated acts, whose meanings are partly shared and partly felt. A person does not step carelessly into a certain cave. A bone is placed a certain way. A body is painted. A hunt is preceded by a movement, a chant, a silence. The community does not separate practical life from spiritual life because it has not yet drawn that line. The visible and invisible belong to one continuous world. A river is waterfish, danger route, memory, and perhaps also presence. An animal is meat, skin, movement, rival, teacher, and perhaps more than merely an animal. This older sacred landscape is difficult for modern language to capture because the word God carries later baggage. It suggests named beings with personalities and family trees, guardians of cities, rulers of sky and sea, recipients of offerings, judges of morality. Those certainly come, and when they do, they reshape civilizations. But the first threshold may be humbler and stranger. It may be the moment humans stop treating every force as impersonal, or the moment they begin to act as though some places are charged with an invisible significance, not reducible to shelter or food, or the moment death becomes socially managed as a passage rather than a disposal, or the moment a dream is remembered as contact. The deeper one looks, the more the story becomes less about invention in the modern sense and more about emergence. Gods emerge out of layers of mental habit, emotional need, ecological pressure, and social memory. The human brain supplies certain tendencies. The environment supplies uncertainty and grandeur. Death supplies the wound that never fully closes. Community supplies ritual repetition. Over thousands upon thousands of years, these ingredients can produce systems of astonishing complexity. But in the beginning, nothing is systematic. There is no clean boundary where belief starts. There is only the slow accumulation of invisible assumptions about how the world works, and that slow accumulation begins far earlier than cities, far earlier than kings, far earlier perhaps than agriculture itself. Long before the first temple rises from shaped stone, people are already living in landscapes dense with signs. They hear messages in unusual events. They treat some objects as more than objects. They return to certain places for reasons the archaeological record can only partly recover. They bury some of their dead with care that exceeds necessity. They enter caves not to live in them but to mark them. They paint animals with precision and mystery in chambers where no daily task requires them to go. Scholars disagree about what exactly these actions mean, and caution is necessary. A burial is not always proof of theology. A painting is not always proof of worship. But taken together, these traces suggest that the path toward gods begins not in formal doctrine, but in the widening suspicion that reality contains layers. So the search for the first gods does not begin with a statue or a hymn. It begins with the kind of creature humans have become by the late Pleistocene, social, symbolic, intensely observant, haunted by death, prone to dream, exquisitely sensitive to pattern, and able to transmit meaning across generations. Such a creature is unlikely to remain forever in a purely material world. Even if no god yet has a name, the conditions for divinity already exist. The unseen is gathering shape. The dead are not entirely gone. The night is full of intention. The cave wall is waiting. The grave is waiting. The sky is waiting. And somewhere in that immense stretch of prehistoric time, long before priests record liturgies, or rulers claim descent from heaven, human beings begin doing something that will alter every civilization to come. They begin treating the invisible not as absence but as presence, Morning comes slowly across the Ice Age plain, not with comfort but with exposure. The dark retreats, and what it reveals is not safety, only detail. Frost clings to grass and bone. Tracks that could not be seen at night now appear in the damp earth, deer, hare, fox, and something heavier that pass close to camp, while the sleepers lay behind their skins and embers. The air smells of ash, damp hide, and old blood. A child wakes from a dream and speaks of someone long dead as though they have just stepped out of sight. An older hunter watches birds wheel above a distant carcass and reads in their movement the possibility of food danger or a warning. Nothing in this landscape is mute for long. Everything seems to point beyond itself. A sound may be only a sound, but it may also be a sign. A dream may be only a dream, but it may also feel like a visit. A death may look final, yet the dead continue to inhabit the living mind with such force that absence begins to feel like a different kind of presence. This is where the first signs of awe likely take shape, not in formal prayer, but in repeated encounters with things that exceed easy explanation. Early humans do not need philosophy to feel this. They only need eyes memory grief and the long exposure to a world that regularly overwhelms them. Fire itself must have seemed like a boundary-breaking substance, half tool and half living thing, consuming wood, giving warmth, moving with appetite, surviving in coals even when it appears to die. The moon changes shape but returns. The sun disappears and comes back. Wounds close. Seeds sprout. Animals migrate with a fidelity that may have looked almost intentional, as though they obeyed hidden agreements within the land. Lightning strikes one tree and not another. Some people dream vividly, fall sick, convulse, recover, and speak, as though they have crossed into a place the others cannot see. None of this requires a god in the later sense, but all of it encourages a habit of perception in which visible events are never merely visible events. All matters here because it is often treated as the softer cousin of fear, when in fact it may be one of the strongest forces shaping human thought. Fear narrows attention, or expands it. Fear asks what will kill me, or asks what kind of world is this. The two frequently overlap, especially in prehistory, where the same storm that terrifies also astonishes, and the same animal that feeds a community can seem magnificent enough to exceed the category of prey. Modern people, insulated by artificial light and predictable walls, can still feel a weakened version of this when standing under a sky, unpolluted by cities, or when watching the sea in a storm, or when entering a cave that swallows sound and daylight together. For Paleolithic humans, such encounters are not occasional escapes from ordinary life. They are ordinary life. Awe is not an interruption. It is woven into daily survival. One of the most powerful engines behind this early sacred imagination may have been dreams. Dreams are easy for the modern mind to dismiss, because modern culture supplies alternative explanations early and often. A dream can be filed away as neurological theatre residue, emotion, memory under strange lighting. But for people without that framework, and especially for people who already live close to death, animals and unstable fortune dreams can carry immense interpretive weight. A person lost in winter appears at night speaking clearly. A dead mother seems present, whole and active. An animal encountered in sleep later appears on the hunt. The dreamer wakes, shaken, convinced not that the mind has produced an illusion but that contact has occurred. Scholars still debate how far dreams shaped early religion because dreams do not fossilize, yet it is difficult to imagine that they did not matter. They offer exactly the kind of experience that blurs the line between life and death, self and other body and soul. This matters because humans are among the few creatures capable not only of dreaming but of telling one another about dreams in elaborate symbolic detail. A dream retold around a fire becomes social fact of a kind. Others interpret it, others remember it, others change behavior because of it. Over time, the private vision becomes communal knowledge. It can warn, authorize, explain, or console. A landscape shaped by dreams is already a landscape partly inhabited by the unseen. The invisible gains texture long before it gains theology. The same may be true of echoes, reflection, shadows, and breath. These seem almost too simple to mention, yet in many traditional belief systems, much later the soul is imagined in relation to breath, shadow, image, or double. The evidence from deep prehistory remains fragmentary, but the raw experiences are universal. A person sees their reflection in still water. They hear their own voice thrown back by stone. They watch breath leave the mouth in cold air like a temporary visible self. They see a shadow keep company with the body and then disappear into darkness. These are not trivial perceptions in a symbolic species. They invite comparison. They generate analogies. They make the self feel divisible, extended, unstable. If a person can appear in a dream and in a reflection, if a voice can come from stone, if breath seems tied to life and vanishes at death, then the idea that a human being contains something more than flesh becomes easier to imagine. Animals likely contribute just as much to this widening sense of hidden power. Paleolithic life is lived among animals not as background scenery, but as competitors, predators, teachers, and sources of nourishment upon whom survival directly depends. Humans track them obsessively. They learn their roots, breeding cycles, temperaments, strengths, and vulnerabilities. They admire what they fear and imitate what they admire. An eagle sees farther. A wolf coordinates better. A stag moves with a grace no human can match. A bear disappears into winter sleep and emerges again, a pattern almost impossible not to notice. The distance between human and animal, so often exaggerated in later civilizations, may have felt less absolute in these early settings. Some anthropologists argue that this encourages forms of animism, the view that personhood or spirit is not confined to humans alone. In such a world, the boundary between species is more permeable in imagination, and sacred power may first gather around beings that are not yet gods but more than human presences. This helps explain why some of the earlier symbolic art so often returns to animals with such intensity. The famous painted chambers of Paleolithic Europe are filled not with ordinary scenes of daily life but with bison horses, aurochs, lions, mammoths, rhinoceroses, deer. Predators and prey alike appear with an attention that is both precise and charged. Scholars still debate whether these images relate to hunting, magic, storytelling, territorial marking, initiation, trance teaching, or combinations of all of these. No single explanation fully accounts for them. Yet whatever else they are, they suggest that animals carry meanings beyond utility. They are not simply counted as calories on the hoof. They occupy the symbolic center of a world in which human life is entangled with powers it does not fully master. The sky offers another kind of lesson. Long before astronomy becomes science, the heavens supply one of the oldest theaters of pattern available to human attention. Even a small group of foragers moving seasonally would notice that certain stars rise in certain times of year, that the moon controls rhythms of darkness and illumination, that solstices and equinox-like transitions affect migration, temperature, plant growth, and animal behavior. Whether early people map this carefully or intuit it loosely, the result is the same. The sky appears ordered in a way the ground often does not. It repeats, it returns, it governs from above without obvious contact. A species already primed to detect agency can easily experience this not as mechanism but as will or order. Awe before the heavens may be among the oldest religious emotions because it combines beauty, regularity, distance, and absolute indifference. The stars do not answer, and yet they seem too consistent to be meaningless. Then there is the strange case of luck. A successful hunt depends on skill, but never on skill alone. Weather shifts, wind turns, a single snapped twig undoes hours of stalking, an animal bolts in the wrong direction and survives. Another stumbles into reach. In a small community where survival rides on unstable outcomes, luck is too important to leave uninterpreted. Ritual can enter here almost naturally. A gesture before departure, a restriction on food or sex before the hunt, a painted mark on the body, the carrying of a specific object. At first, these may be habits, traditions, or tested routines whose origins are barely remembered. But if they seem to correlate with success, they gather force. The world starts to look responsive. It can be approached rightly or wrongly. There are better and worse ways to meet its hidden powers. This is not irrational in the crude sense often implied by modern hindsight. It is an attempt to manage uncertainty in a world where uncertainty kills. Even today, athletes, soldiers, surgeons and gamblers develop rituals under pressure. The difference is that Paleolithic humans live inside pressure continuously, and their rituals are reinforced not by entertainment or superstition on the margins of life, but by the full weight of hunger, weather fertility, and death. Over generations, such acts can become traditional even when their original practical use fades. They become part of how reality is handled. Lesser-known details from recent anthropological thinking suggest that childhood may also play a role here. Human children are unusually dependent, unusually observant, and unusually prone to absorbing causal explanations from adults, long before they can test those explanations independently. In societies where the environment is dangerous and knowledge is inherited socially, children learn not just where to walk and what to eat, but what kinds of presence occupy a river, a grove, a cave, a burial place. They learn how to behave toward things that adults treat with caution. By the time they are grown, the sacred geography of their world feels less like a theory and more like the obvious structure of reality. Religion in this early sense may spread not through conversion, but through upbringing. It is breathed in with language. And still none of this yet requires gods with names. That is important. The first signs of awe do not necessarily lead straight to Olympus or Egypt or Mesopotamia. They may instead sustain a long era in which the world is alive with powers, but not yet ruled by distinct divine personalities. The sacred may be localized, fluid, situational. A dead relative matters here. A cave matters there. A herd matters in one season, a storm matters at one crossing. This older way of sensing the world may remain dominant for tens of thousands of years. What survives in the record suggests continuity more than sudden invention. Yet awe, once stabilized socially, changes human behavior in durable ways. It encourages reverence towards certain places. It makes some objects untouchable except under special conditions. It deepens memory because what is sacred must be remembered accurately. It creates roles for those who interpret unusual events better than others. It can reinforce social cohesion if a group shares rituals tied to invisible forces. It can also intensify grief by turning the dead into beings who must be handled properly, not simply lost. Little by little, the unseen acquires structure. The earliest sacred world, then, is not a palace full of gods. It is a field of charged relationships. Humans, animals, ancestors, weather, landscapes, sleep and death all seem entangled in ways too important to ignore. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars argue over how much can safely be inferred from burials, art and ethnographic comparison. But the pattern is difficult to miss. Long before scripture, long before temples, long before anyone writes down the deeds of heaven, human beings are already living as though some things in the world are more than they appear. They fear them, yes. They depend on them. They court them. They avoid offending them. They seek signs from them. Above all, they feel them. And from that feeling comes one of the most decisive turns in human history. Once awe attaches itself to memory and ritual, it does not remain an emotion. It becomes a way of organizing reality. The dead are no longer only absent. Dreams are no longer only private. Animals are no longer only creatures. Darkness is no longer only the lack of light. The world thickens with meanings. The invisible begins to take on obligations, and soon one of the most revealing places to look for those obligations will be the place where every society is forced to confront what it cannot master for long: the human body after life has left it. The body lies where the breathing once was. That may be the oldest human shock. A face remains a face for a while. The hands are still familiar hands. The hair, the scars, the shape of the shoulders, the marks of work and age all remain visible. And yet the person has gone somewhere impossible to describe. The body is present, unmistakably present, but whatever made it a person has slipped beyond touch. For any human community capable of memory, affection, and symbolic thought, this is not merely a practical problem. It is a wound in the fabric of ordinary understanding. What exactly has left? Where has it gone? Can it return? Does it linger? Does it need something? Can it help or harm the living? No matter how early in prehistory one looks, these questions sit quietly behind the treatment of the dead, because death creates the strongest possible contrast between flesh and presence. This is why burials matter so much in the search for early religion. Not because every burial proves belief in gods, and not because archaeologists can read graves like books, but because the dead force choices. A body can be abandoned, consumed by scavengers, left in the open, placed in water, burned, broken apart, preserved, covered, painted, carried, buried with care, or revisited again and again. Each choice says something about how the living understand the dead, even if it says that only dimly. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate where practical disposal ends and symbolic treatment begins. But what survives in the record suggests that long before humans build temples, many of them are already doing something highly significant with their dead. They are handling them as if death changes a person without erasing them completely. Some of the earliest burials associated with archaic and early modern humans remain controversial, precisely because the farther back the evidence goes, the harder it becomes to distinguish intention from accident. A body found in a depression may have been placed there deliberately, or it may have settled there through natural processes. A scattering of pollen once hailed as evidence for flowers in a Neanderthal grave may instead have come from burrowing animals. Archaeology has learned caution the hard way. Romantic interpretations are easy to make and hard to prove. Yet even with that caution, there are graves from the Middle Paleolithic, and later that are difficult to dismiss as random disposal. Bodies are placed in specific positions. Some are accompanied by tools, pigments, ornaments, animal parts, or unusual objects. Some sites show repeated use. What exactly these acts mean is uncertain, but they are not indifferent acts. That distinction matters. Indifference leaves fewer patterns. Care leaves traces. In several Upper Paleolithic burials, red ochre appears with the dead staining bones and soil with iron-rich pigment that looks strikingly like blood. Ochre has many possible uses. It can preserve hides, mark bodies, and serve practical needs. But when it appears in graves in repeated and deliberate ways, it begins to feel symbolic. Scholars debate whether it represents life, rebirth, status, purification, or something else entirely. No single explanation fully accounts for it. Still, the repeated use of red in burial settings suggests that colour itself has entered the realm of meaning. The dead are no longer disposed of only as dangerous remains. They are transformed through ritual gesture. There is something profoundly revealing in that. Ritual begins where practical necessity is exceeded. To dig a grave is already labor. To place a body carefully is more labor. To add ochre ornaments, tools, beads, antlers, blades, shells carried from far away, or the remains of animals is to do more than sanitation requires. It is to say without writing a word that the dead continue to matter. A child buried with thousands of beads, as in the famous Sunga site in Ice Age Russia, was not simply hidden from decay. That child was marked, distinguished, remembered through effort so extraordinary that even now it startles. The labour represented by those beads is immense. Each one had to be made pierced, handled, arranged. Such treatment suggests social meaning far beyond disposal. Whether that meaning points to afterlife status, lineage, ancestral importance, or all of these together, it shows that death has become culturally elaborated. This is one of the strongest clues in the long prehistory of gods. Before named deities dominate the sacred world, the dead may stand much closer to the centre. Ancestors or proto-ancestors are easier to imagine than sky-ruling gods, because they are socially continuous with the living. They were here. Their faces are known. Their voices are remembered. Their tools remain. Their places in the group do not vanish instantly just because the body has failed. Many later traditional societies give the dead a long afterlife inside social memory, treating them as ongoing presences who can bless, punish, guide, or require offerings. It would be simplistic to project those systems directly backward into the Paleolithic, but the possibility that early belief begins with the dead rather than with distant creators is a serious one. If humans first invent any enduring invisible persons, the dead are among the strongest candidates. Dreams reinforce this possibility with remarkable force. A dead relative appears at night speaking or moving exactly as before. For a modern person, this can be emotionally intense but conceptually manageable. For a prehistoric person living without a firm, naturalistic explanation of consciousness, dreams could be powerful evidence that the dead persist in another state. The body in the ground is still. The person in the dream is active. The contradiction demands interpretation. One solution, perhaps one of the oldest, is that some part of the person survives bodily death. Whether this surviving part is imagined as breath, shadow, soul image, or some other essence, it bridges an otherwise impossible gap. A burial then becomes not merely the handling of remains, but the management of a transition. That may explain why some graves appear prepared almost as if the dead are being equipped. Grave goods are often discussed in dramatic terms as proof that ancient people believed they would literally use these items in another world. Sometimes that may be true. Sometimes it may be too literal a reading. Goods in graves can also express who the dead were, what relations bound them to the living, or how the living wished to be seen by one another. A burial can communicate to the community as much as to the dead. But even that does not weaken its sacred significance, it only deepens it. Death is never only about the deceased. It reorganizes the living. It redistributes emotion, labor, memory, and authority. Ritual burial helps control that chaos. There are lesser-known details in the archaeology of burial that make this even more complex. In some prehistoric contexts, bodies are not left whole. Skulls are removed, curated, or repositioned. Bones are rearranged after decomposition. Secondary burial practices appear in which the dead are first allowed to decay elsewhere, and are later reburied in altered form. At sites in the later Neolithic and early village worlds, skull plastering and ancestor display will become much more visible, but the basic impulse may be older. The dead are not simply gone and done with. Their remains can remain active in social life. This is a difficult idea for modern societies, which often prefer finality and distance, but in many ancient communities the dead may have remained close physically and mentally for long periods. A skull kept or revisited is not merely a leftover object, it is a material anchor for memory and perhaps for presence. This closeness complicates the usual story that religion begins with fear of nature alone. Nature matters certainly. Storms, animals, drought, and celestial order all shape early belief. But the dead may shape it more intimately. A storm is immense and external. A dead mother, sibling, hunter, or child is intimate, personal, impossible to forget. The emotional force of bereavement can hold invisible presence near the centre of human life, far more steadily than occasional terror before the sky. Scholars still debate the relative importance of ancestor veneration in deep prehistory, because direct evidence is sparse, yet grief is universal and socially formative. Once communities begin remembering certain dead as more than memories, the path toward a populated, unseen world grows much clearer. There is another practical dimension to burial that may have helped transform death into sacred action. Corpses are dangerous. They attract scavengers. They smell. They can spread disease, though prehistoric people wouldn't describe it in those terms. Managing the dead is therefore necessary, but necessity often becomes ritualized. Washing a body, wrapping it, placing it, speaking over it, painting it, orienting it in a particular direction, visiting it afterward, these are all ways of turning raw disposal into meaningful order. Humans repeatedly turn necessary acts into symbolic acts, especially when those acts concern thresholds: birth, puberty, mating, illness, and death. Burial may therefore sit at the junction where hygiene, grief, and cosmology meet. The body must be handled. The loss must be understood. Ritual does both at once. And because burial is communal, it teaches belief socially. Children see adults pause, lower their voices, alter their movements, avoid certain jokes, perform certain gestures, place certain things in the earth, and not others. The dead become a domain governed by special rules. Such rules do not need written doctrines to become durable. They need repetition, emotion, and visible seriousness. Over generations, burial customs can stabilize ideas about personhood, kinship, status, contamination, memory, and the possibility of another realm. The community learns not only that death matters, but how it matters. This is one of the ways invisible worlds become inherited. The treatment of children in some prehistoric graves is especially haunting and especially revealing. In many later societies, high infant mortality is sometimes assumed to produce emotional distance, as if frequent death makes loss easier. The archaeological record offers little support for that cynical idea. Some child burials are among the most elaborate known. Even when survival is precarious, grief remains capable of enormous expression. The burial of children with care ornaments and pigment suggests not only love, but the extension of symbolic value to lives that had scarcely begun. That is important because it widens the sacred field. Meaning is not reserved for accomplished adults alone. The dead child, too, is held within a world of ritual concern. A community that buries its children with care has already crossed far beyond mere practicality. Of course, caution remains essential. Not every grave good proves belief in an afterlife. Not every careful burial implies a soul concept. Archaeologists are right to resist overconfident storytelling, because once symbolism enters interpretation, it becomes easy to see certainty where only plausibility exists. A bead may mark identity rather than equip a spirit. Ochre may be tradition rather than theology. A curled body may reflect the shape of a grave rather than fetal rebirth symbolism. The evidence remains incomplete and many older claims have been softened or abandoned. But the overall pattern still points in one direction. The dead are being treated as socially and symbolically potent beings. They require more than removal. That requirement may be one of the first great training grounds for religion. To bury is to admit that a person is no longer alive and yet not reducible to waste. To revisit the grave is to sustain a relationship across absence. To furnish the dead is to imagine continuity, whether literal or remembered. To fear the restless dead is to grant them agency. To invoke ancestors is to create an invisible community parallel to the living one. None of this yet demands gods as later civilizations will know them, but it produces something just as important, a structured unseen population. Once the dead can remain socially real, the human mind has already stepped far into sacred territory, and sacred territory rarely stays confined to graves. The logic spreads. If the dead linger, perhaps places do too. If bones carry presence, perhaps caves do as well. If red ochre can transform a burial, perhaps images deep in darkness can transform a hunt, a season, a soul. The same species that lowers its dead into the earth with pigment and beads is also in other places moving beyond the reach of daylight to paint walls no ordinary task requires. There too the visible world is being treated as only one layer of something deeper. There too humans behave as if contact with another order of reality is possible. And in those dark chambers far from the weather and the camp, the first sacred geography begins to take on stone and shadow. The entrance narrows and daylight fails quickly. A few steps inside the world begins to change its rules. The air cools, sound thickens, moisture gathers on stone. Shadows no longer fall in familiar ways because shadows now come from carried flame, not from the sun. A hand lifted before the face glows red for an instant and then vanishes again into the dark. The deeper chambers twist and open unpredictably. Walls bulge where none should bulge. Cracks resemble mouths. Stalagmites rise like frozen growths from the floor. The cave does not feel built for ordinary human life. It feels borrowed, entered on uncertain terms, like a place belonging first to darkness itself, and only secondarily to the living. Anyone who has walked deep underground knows how quickly the mind begins to people such spaces. Distance becomes difficult to judge. Echoes come from directions that seem wrong. The ordinary map of the world anchored by horizon and sky collapses. If any landscape could teach early humans that reality has hidden layers, it is this one. That may be why caves occupy such an extraordinary place in the archaeology of early symbolism. Not all caves are sacred. Many are shelters, storage places, practical refuges. But some chambers, especially deep painted chambers, do not look practical at all. They require deliberate movement into dangerous darkness. Some are difficult to reach even now. The most famous examples from Upper Paleolithic Europe, Chauvet-Lascaux, Altamira, and others contain art of astonishing skill and intensity, yet much of that art lies far from daily living areas. This is one of the strongest clues that the purpose of these spaces exceeds decoration. People are not simply brightening their homes. They're entering another kind of place and leaving marks where ordinary life does not need marks. The paintings themselves deepen the mystery. Horses surge across stone ridges that seem to make them move. Bison lower their heads as if in tension or warning. Lions appear lean, quiet, and watchful. Rhinoceroses, mammoths, deer, aurochs, ibex, and creatures both familiar and rare gather in sequences that are not quite narrative and not quite random. Sometimes a natural curve in the wall becomes the shoulder of an animal. Sometimes scratches, dots, handprints, or abstract signs appear beside the figures as if the artists are recording something more than the animals themselves. Human figures are scarce and often distorted. The balance is striking. The caves are full of life, but not of ordinary human life. It's as if people descend underground to place the more than human at the center. Scholars still debate what these painted caves are for, and the debates have lasted for generations, because no single explanation fully accounts for all the evidence. One older theory proposed hunting magic paint the animal master. The animal improve the hunt. There are reasons to think ritual and hunting may indeed overlap, but the theory is too narrow on its own. Some species painted were not major food sources. Some dangerous predators appear with great care despite limited practical utility. Other researchers have emphasized myth-teaching initiation, territorial marking, social memory, or structured encounters with altered states of consciousness. More recently, many scholars lean toward mixed explanations. A cave can be many things at once: ritual stage teaching, site memory, palace, mythic map, acoustic chamber, and threshold between ordinary space and another order of experience. That idea of threshold may be the most useful. A cave is neither open landscape nor human settlement. It belongs to the earth but lies beneath it. It is entered through a mouth-like opening and descends into hidden chambers. Water drips in darkness. Strange forms emerge from stone itself. Firelight turns still images into moving presences. In later mythologies across many cultures, caves become places of birth, death, revelation, monsters, gods, ancestors, and entrances to underworlds. It would be too easy to project those later meanings backward and declare the Paleolithic caves to be clear underworld shrines. The evidence remains incomplete. Yet the physical properties of caves already make them ideal environments for sacred interpretation. They separate the visitor from ordinary light, ordinary sound, and ordinary orientation. They induce a sense of crossing. Lesser-known details from cave research make this even more compelling. Some deep chambers have remarkable acoustics with echoes that amplify certain spots more than others. In a few sites, concentrations of paintings seem to correspond at least partly with resonant locations. This does not prove chanting or drumming, but it raises the possibility that sound mattered in these spaces as much as sight. A torch flickering against painted forms accompanied by echoing footsteps, breath, voice, or percussion would create an experience far more immersive than a modern photograph can suggest. The cave would not be a gallery. It would be an event. It would surround the body and destabilize the senses. The handprints are especially haunting. Negative hands created by blowing pigment around the hand pressed to stone leave behind a silhouette of someone who was there and is gone now. Positive hands pressed or painted directly do something similar. They are among the clearest moments in prehistory where an individual seems to say, "I was present here." But even that may be too modern an interpretation. The handprint is not a signature in the modern sense. It is more ambiguous, more charged. A hand on a cave wall deep underground is both a trace of a person and a kind of partial self detached from the body. It is presence-made image. It is contact between flesh and stone. In a world already sensitive to shadows, reflections, doubles, and enduring traces of the dead, such marks may have carried meanings beyond identity alone. They make the cave wall itself into a meeting surface between human and something other. Then there are the rare composite or ambiguous figures, human and animal mixed, or human forms, rendered in ways that seem transformed. These figures are not common, but where they appear they have attracted endless fascination, because they hint at a mental world in which boundaries can be crossed. The so-called Lion Man from Hohenstein-Stadel, though not a cave painting but an ivory figurine from the Upper Paleolithic, stands as one of the most startling examples. Carved tens of thousands of years ago, it appears to combine human and lion features in deliberate form. Scholars debate what it represents. a mythic being, a masked person, a visionary image, a ritual role. The evidence cannot decide, but such objects suggest that early sacred imagination is not limited to isolated animals or dead relatives. It is capable of hybrid presence transformation and beings that belong to neither ordinary category completely. If gods have distant ancestors, some may begin in exactly this zone between species dream and ritual performance. Caves also preserve signs of repeated return: soot marks, footprints, torches, engravings layered over time and repainting all imply that these chambers are not visited once and forgotten. People go back. That alone is significant. Returning to a difficult place usually means the place has value not exhausted by practical use. A deep cave may become what later societies would call a shrine, though the word risks imposing too much structure. Better to say that some caves seem to become charged places in collective memory. The group knows them, reaches them, uses them under conditions that are probably special. Not everyone may go, not everyone may understand. The space begins to accumulate authority. This is important because sacred space is one of the great inventions of human culture. A sacred place is not merely a useful place. It is a place where reality feels denser. Rules may shift and actions matter differently. The existence of such places changes society because it creates geography out of meaning. Certain locations now demand behavior. They may require preparation, permission, silence, paint, song, abstinence, or fear. Once a community agrees that some places are unlike others, the world becomes organized not only by food and danger, but by significance. That is a profound transformation, and the caves may be among its earliest durable expressions. Some researchers have also suggested that the sensory deprivation and danger of deep cave entry could contribute to altered states. Darkness, flickering light, smoke, echo, confinement, and physical strain all affect perception. If combined with fasting, rhythmic sound, or other ritual practices, they could intensify visionary experience. This is one reason shamanic interpretations have remained influential, though they are contested. Ethnographic comparisons with later hunting and foraging societies can be illuminating, but they must be handled carefully. No Ice Age artist can be interviewed, and no living tradition is a direct fossil of Paleolithic thought. Still, the idea that caves serve as places where some people seek contact with spirits, animal powers, or other realms remains plausible because it fits both the sensory environment and the symbolic density of the art. Another surprising detail is how little the cave art sometimes resembles simple storytelling in sequence. Instead of one clear scene, many walls hold layered accumulations. One animal superimposed upon another marks added generations apart clusters of signs whose meaning is lost. This layering suggests that the cave is not a single message but a continuing conversation. People add to what is already there. They respond to older marks. They inhabit a symbolic tradition extending beyond one lifespan. That continuity matters enormously. It means the cave may function not just as sacred encounter, but as collective memory. Images endure in darkness, while the makers die. Later visitors see them and enter a space already inhabited by ancestral marks. In that sense, the cave becomes social across time. It joins the living to the dead, and perhaps that is part of its power. Underground, in a chamber visited by firelight, surrounded by images made by unknown hands years or generations before a person stands among presences. Animal presences, human presences, ancestral presences. The cave wall carries memory without words. What survives in the record suggests that the world below ground becomes one of the first enduring theatres in which humans stage relationships with the unseen. Not unseen because nothing is there, but unseen because what is there belongs partly to another order, memory, spirit, danger, transformation, sacred force. The step from such places to later gods is still a long one. It should not be rushed. A cave painting is not yet a temple cult. A handprint is not yet a theology. But the mental architecture is becoming clearer. Humans are distinguishing certain places from ordinary places. They are filling darkness with image and significance. They are performing acts that seem designed to reach beyond immediate utility. They are entering environments where animal life, death memory, and altered perception overlap. The visible world is being opened from within as though stone itself can reveal another layer if approached correctly. And in those layers, one kind of presence appears again and again with overwhelming force: animals. Not simply as prey, not simply as danger, but as beings carrying a concentrated power humans seem both to pursue and to revere. To understand when gods begin, it is not enough to stand before graves and caves. It is also necessary to follow the hunters out again into the cold, open world and see the creatures they depend on with different eyes, not as resources alone, but as neighbours, rivals, teachers, and perhaps the first bearers of the sacred. The herd appears first as movement, then as sound, and only after that as bodies. A ripple along the far grass, a tremor underfoot, the brief flashing line of horns in morning light. Then the full animal mass resolves itself from the landscape, as if the land has decided to stand up and run. For a hunting people, this is never a neutral sight. It is promise and risk at once. The herd means food, hide, sinew, bone tools, warmth, survival. It also means failure, injury, trampling, wasted effort, and the sharp humiliation of watching life escape over the ridge after hours of silence and patience. To live near animals at this level of dependence is to study them with an intensity modern people rarely experience. Every movement matters. Every season matters. The difference between famine and abundance may rest on whether one species turns left at a river crossing and another arrives 2 weeks late. Under such pressure, animals do not remain mere background creatures. They take on weight, presence, character. They become central facts of the universe. This is why some of the oldest sacred feeling may gather not around sky gods or creator beings, but around the more immediate powers of animal life. The hunter watches the stag and sees more than meat. He sees alertness so refined that the animal senses danger before it is visible. He sees speed no human can match, hearing tuned to tremors in the air muscles coiled with elegant violence. The lion, the bear, the aurochs, the wolf, the mammoth, the eagle each embodies capacities humans lack and yet need to understand. In a world where survival depends on reading animal intention, it becomes easy to imagine that animals possess inner force knowledge or agency beyond the ordinary. Some anthropologists have long argued that early religion may emerge within this field of attention, where animals are not just hunted things, but powerful others whose cooperation, appearance, disappearance, and death all require explanation. This does not mean Paleolithic people simply worship animals in some uncomplicated sense. That old idea repeated too loosely obscures more than it reveals. What survives in the record suggests something subtler. Animals may be treated as persons of another kind, beings with whom humans enter into dangerous exchange. A hunt is not merely a mechanical act of acquisition. It can feel like a relationship governed by rules, respect, and risk. Even in much later foraging societies documented by ethnographers, prey animals are sometimes understood as giving themselves under certain conditions, withholding themselves under others, or requiring proper ritual treatment after death. These beliefs vary enormously and cannot be projected backward without caution, but they show how hunting life can support a sacred moral economy between species. The kill is never purely technical. It carries tension because the creature taken was animate-aware and powerful in its own domain. That tension may help explain the strange mix of realism and reverence in Paleolithic animal imagery. The painters of Chauvet or Lascaux do not sketch animals casually. They observe them with loving precision, then place them in darkness under conditions that suggest more than instruction. A bison's shoulder is not simply correct, it is monumental. A horse's flank seems to hold motion in reserve. A lion's stare has the stillness of another intelligence. These are images of intimacy, but not of ownership. Humans know these animals well, yet the art does not reduce them to domesticated familiarity. They remain other. That otherness may be one of the earliest forms of the sacred, the recognition that another being exists with its own will, its own power, and its own kind of world. There is also the matter of imitation. Human beings have always learned through mimicry, and early hunters likely copied animal movement not only for practical stalking, but for play teaching and ritual. A body crouching like a cat, stamping like a hoofed beast, raising arms like antlers, or masking the face with skull hide or horn, crosses a significant threshold. For a moment, the person does not merely observe the animal, but enters its pattern. This can be deeply practical in hunting, but it can also become ceremonial. A masked dancer is still human, of course, yet the act of transformation matters. It suggests that the line between human and animal can be explored, negotiated, and perhaps temporarily crossed. In that imaginative crossing lies one possible ancestor of later divine imagery, where beings become hybrid, liminal more than human. Some of the most intriguing objects from prehistory live exactly in this uncertain zone. The Lion Man figurine is one example, but it's not alone in hinting at a world where species boundaries are symbolically permeable. Composite beings in cave art antlered, or therianthropic figures and images whose meaning remains disputed, all suggest that humans sometimes envision persons who are not simply men, women, or beasts. Scholars still debate whether such images reflect masked ritual specialists. Mythic beings, visions seen in trance, or narrative figures from traditions now lost beyond recovery. The evidence remains incomplete. Yet whatever the answer, these forms reveal a mind already capable of imagining that sacred power might take shape through animal-human fusion rather than through distant abstraction. Before gods rule cities, sacred beings may wear fur, horn, claw, and human posture at once. This possibility becomes even stronger when one considers how much knowledge early humans derived from animals. Animals locate water, predict weather, reveal the season, teach routes across landscapes, and expose the health of an ecosystem, long before humans could describe ecology. Birds gathering may indicate carrion. Ungulate paths reveal safe crossings. Predator absence can mean disturbance. Migration teaches time. Hibernation hints at disappearance and return. A bear going into the earth and emerging months later must have carried an almost impossible symbolic charge for human observers. So too the annual shedding and regrowth of antlers, the metamorphosis of insects, the return of salmon, the sudden abundance of spawning fish. After lean periods, the near magical navigation of birds. To modern science, these are biological processes. To prehistoric humans, they are recurring marvels built directly into survival. The world teaches through animals, and what teaches may easily become sacred. There is a lesser known but revealing pattern in the archaeology of many later hunter-gatherer and early farming traditions. Animal remains are not always discarded casually after use. Horns may be arranged. Skulls may be displayed. Particular bones may be treated with more care than others. At Göbekli Tepe much later, animal imagery dominates monumental stonework. In Neolithic villages, cattle skulls and horns sometimes take on architectural importance. In many societies beyond prehistory, the remains of powerful animals become talismans, ritual objects, boundary markers, or ancestral emblems. None of this proves a single continuous tradition from the Paleolithic onward, but it does suggest a durable pattern in human thought. Animals repeatedly become vessels for concentrated symbolic force. They do so not because humans fail to distinguish themselves from other creatures, but because they recognize in animals capacities, dangers, and presences that demand special treatment. The sacred relationship with prey may also contain an ethical paradox that becomes central to later religion. Humans depend on killing beings they admire. That contradiction needs handling. The hunter cannot survive without taking life, yet repeated close attention to animals makes pure indifference difficult. One solution is gratitude. Another is apology. Another is ritual control. Another is the belief that the animal spirit returns, renews, or permits the hunt under proper conditions. Ethnographic records from various circumpolar and indigenous traditions much later show how elaborate this logic can become, though no direct line can be assumed. Still, the basic problem is ancient. How does a symbolic species live morally with the killing that sustains it? Sacred practice offers one answer by placing the act inside a larger relationship, rather than treating it as brute extraction. Predators intensify this sense of animal power in a different way. Prehistoric humans are not only hunters. For much of their history they are also hunted. Lions, wolves, leopards, bears, hyenas, and other carnivores compete with them for territory, scavenge carcasses and dominance. This is a world in which humans are not automatically at the top. They share the landscape with eyes that gleam outside the firelight and teeth that can make a person vanish into brush within seconds. Fear of predators is not abstract. It is lived nightly bodily. Yet fear alone does not explain the fascination predators hold in early imagery. They are dangerous, yes, but also embodiments of mastery. To watch a lion move through grass or a wolf pack coordinate at speed is to witness forms of excellence. The predator becomes a mirror for human ambition, a rival whose strengths may be envied as much as dreaded. This may be why later warrior societies across the world so often identify themselves with predator qualities, and why masks, skins, claws, and teeth carry prestige. The roots of that symbolic appropriation likely reach deep. Humans do not merely defend against animal power. They borrow it. They wear it, name themselves through it, tell stories with it. A child growing up in such a world learns quickly that species are not just biological categories. They are moral, symbolic, and emotional ones. The wolf may stand for more than the wolf. The bear may stand for more than the bear. This does not automatically make them gods, but it does make them carriers of sacred charge. Ancestor belief may intertwine with this animal field in ways that are now almost impossible to disentangle. In some later traditions, clan origins are traced to particular animals. In others, dead relatives return through animal signs. Elsewhere, shamans travel in animal form or speak with animal masters. Deep prehistory offers only scattered hints, yet the logic is coherent. If the dead remain near, and if animals already seem to possess unusual agency, then the two spheres can overlap. A bird seen after a burial may become more than a bird. A recurring animal at a particular place may become linked with memory, lineage, or taboo. The sacred world thickens not by neatly separating categories, but by allowing them to bleed together. All this suggests that one of the earliest religious revolutions is not the invention of a supreme being, but the discovery that human life takes place inside a network of relationships with non-human powers. A person is not alone in a neutral environment. He lives among presences. Some feed him, some stalk him, some guide him, some appear in dreams, some return in carved ivory or painted stone. Some may become ancestors of myths that later civilizations only dimly remember. The word animism is often used here, though it can be both useful and misleading. Useful because it captures the sense that agency and inwardness are not limited to humans. Misleading because it can sound like a tidy doctrine rather than a lived and shifting orientation to the world. Early sacred life is probably less systematic than that. It is practical, emotional, embodied, and constantly tested against hunger and danger, and yet it is not merely instinctive. Over time, repeated relationships with animal power seem to produce specialist people more skilled at interpreting signs, performing transformations, or handling the dangerous crossings between human and non-human realms. A group may tolerate ordinary reverence, but some individuals go further. They fast, they bleed, they dream harder, they perform, they enter states others fear or admire. In later societies, such people may be called shamans, healers, seers, ritual experts. The label is modern and imperfect, but the role may be ancient. Once sacred power is thought to move through animals' dreams and altered perception, someone must learn to travel that terrain more deliberately than others. That is where the story darkens and deepens, because once humans believe that certain people can enter the unseen and return with knowledge, the invisible is no longer only a background presence. It becomes a domain that can be approached, negotiated, and perhaps controlled. Animal power no longer lives only in the herd, the predator, or the painted wall. It enters the human body through trance, costume dance, ordeal, and vision. And in that crossing between ordinary awareness and altered reality, the first true intermediaries between human communities and the unseen may begin to emerge. Night gathers differently when a community expects one person not merely to sleep, but to go elsewhere. The fire is low. Bodies settle under hide and fur. The ordinary noises of camp begin to thin a cough, a child turning embers shifting in ash. Then one figure remains wakeful, or seems to. Perhaps the face is painted. Perhaps a drum begins in a slow repetitive pulse. Perhaps there is only breathing, rocking silence and the long patience of darkness. In later centuries, many cultures will call such a person a healer, diviner, medium, ecstatic, or shaman. Though every word comes with problems and no Ice Age community left a title behind. Still, what survives in the record and in careful anthropological comparison suggests that very early in human history, some individuals may have been treated as specialists in crossing the fragile line between the visible world and whatever lies behind it. If gods were not yet fully formed, the journey toward them may still have required guides. This is one of the most compelling and most contested ideas in the study of early religion. For more than a century, scholars have proposed that altered states of consciousness play a central role in the development of sacred belief. The basic logic is powerful. Human beings everywhere are capable of entering unusual mental conditions through fasting, dancing, drumming, pain, sleep, disruption, sensory deprivation, psychoactive plants, illness, fever, grief, hyperventilation, and extreme emotional stress. In such states, the ordinary boundaries of self can loosen. Time distorts. Sounds and images intensify. Patterns become charged. A person may feel watched, lifted, dissolved, transformed, or accompanied by presences whose reality is overwhelming in the moment. If such experiences occur in a symbolic species that already buries its dead dreams, vividly paints caves and treats animals as more than mere animals, then these states do not remain private neurological events. They become interpreted encounters, they become evidence. That may be one of the great turning points in the long invention of gods. Or burial dream and animal power prepare the ground, but altered states give many of those invisible possibilities a felt immediacy. A dream can be dismissed by others. A trance performed publicly, especially if it is followed by healing prediction or persuasive speech, is hard to ignore. The community sees the person shake, chant, withdraw, collapse, recover, or return, with knowledge that seems to exceed ordinary awareness. Scholars still debate how much of this can be projected back into the Paleolithic, because archaeology rarely preserves states of mind directly. But the evidence remains suggestive. The deep cave environments, the strange hybrid figures, the repeated ritual spaces, and the enduring human tendency toward ecstatic practice all point toward the possibility that some people were already occupying roles defined by unusual access to the unseen. The word shaman is often used for these roles, but it should be handled carefully. Strictly speaking, it comes from specific Siberian contexts, and was too often universalized by earlier scholars, as though every ritual expert everywhere were the same kind of figure. That simplification has been criticized for good reason. Human cultures vary too widely for one label to fit neatly across all times and places. Yet the underlying pattern remains valuable. Many societies, ancient and recent, distinguish between ordinary members and certain people who specialize in crossing thresholds between sickness and recovery life, and death, human and animal waking and dream village and wilderness. Whether one calls them shamans or not, such specialists matter because they turn diffuse sacred feeling into social role. And roles change everything. Once a group recognizes that some individuals are better at entering unusual states, remembering dreams, reading signs, or dealing with the dead, sacred power begins to concentrate. It is no longer everywhere in exactly the same way. It can now be approached through people with particular knowledge, temperaments, or reputations. This does not yet create priesthoods in the later institutional sense, but it creates authority. A talented hunter has one kind of authority. A successful toolmaker has another. A person who seems able to speak with spirits, retrieve lost souls, cure strange illnesses, or locate game through vision has a different and potentially deeper one. The invisible starts to acquire interpreters. There are good reasons to think such authority might have emerged very early. Human beings are extraordinarily responsive to ritual performance. Repetition, rhythm, costume ordeal, and emotional intensity all make experiences feel more real and more collective. A figure wearing antlers, animal skins, or body paint can become in the minds of witnesses not just disguised but transformed. Firelight strengthens the effect. In darkness or flickering torchlight, the body becomes unstable to perception. Movements blur. Shadows enlarge. A dancer can seem more than human. This is one reason composite figures in cave art remain so provocative. Whether they depict mythic beings, masked practitioners, or visions, they suggest a symbolic world in which transformation is imaginable and perhaps expected. Some researchers have linked Upper Paleolithic art to trance imagery itself. Certain abstract signs in toptic patterns and hybrid forms have been interpreted as visual motifs associated with altered states. The theory is attractive because it connects cave experience, sensory stress, and visionary imagery into one framework. But it is also controversial. Human perception in altered states does produce recurring visual phenomena, yet not every dot, zigzag, or ambiguous figure must be reduced to neurology. The danger is over-explaining symbolic complexity with one mechanism. No single explanation fully accounts for the art. Still, the broader claim that altered consciousness could have shaped sacred imagery and social ritual remains plausible and influential. What makes altered states especially powerful in the origins of religion is that they feel authoritative from the inside. A person who sees a dead relative in a dream may wake uncertain. A person who endures prolonged ritual stress and experiences the dead as present may feel transformed beyond argument. In many later traditions, vision does not merely illustrate belief, it creates belief. A seer does not reason a spirit into existence. The spirit arrives or seems to in experience. Once such experiences are narrated, repeated, and socially validated, they become part of collective knowledge. The unseen no longer rests only on inference from death or weather, it has witnesses. This may also help explain why sickness and healing are so often bound to early religion. Illness is one of the oldest sources of helplessness in human life. It comes invisibly, unpredictably, and sometimes vanishes just as mysteriously. A person burns with fever, mutters, strangely convulses, wastes away, or recovers after ritual attention that cannot be easily disentangled from natural variation. In communities without biomedicine, the healer who can make sense of such episodes holds enormous value. Healing rites do not need to be medically effective in the modern sense to matter profoundly. They organize fear, attention, care, and hope. They may reduce stress, reinforce communal support, and sometimes genuinely help. Just as important, they explain suffering by locating it in a world of spirits, offended powers, lost souls, broken taboos, or intrusive forces. Pain becomes narratable. The lesser-known detail here is that many early ritual specialists in ethnographic comparison are not simply respectable officials. They are often marked by liminality. They may be unusual, emotionally intense, physically afflicted, socially ambiguous, or shaped by periods of isolation and ordeal. Their authority comes partly from having crossed something dangerous. That pattern may be very ancient. A person who nearly dies survives fever, suffers seizures, dreams continuously, or behaves strangely may be feared in one context and revered in another. What looks like pathology to one observer can look like calling to another. Scholars have sometimes suggested that experiences modern psychiatry would classify in one way may in earlier societies have been interpreted spiritually. This should not be romanticized, but it does reveal how porous the boundary between illness and revelation can be in sacred history. If this is true, then the invention of gods is tied not only to collective anxiety and shared ritual, but also to exceptional minds and bodies. Some individuals become laboratories of the sacred. Through them, the community explores what lies beyond ordinary awareness. Through them, animals speak ancestors, instruct weather-warns, and the dead linger in forms that seem actionable. A world already dense with signs becomes denser still when someone claims not merely to sense those signs, but to enter their source. This process also encourages story. Visionary experience alone is chaotic. To become socially useful, it must be told, shaped, remembered, and fitted into patterns others recognize. A healer returns from trance and recounts what was seen. A dream is interpreted through older stories. A successful cure confirms a narrative. A failed ritual may require new explanation. Over time, these explanations harden. The invisible realm gains recurring inhabitants. Pathways, dangers, and rules. This is a crucial step. Spirits stop being isolated impressions and begin to form a kind of population. Certain beings appear again and again. Certain animal powers recur. Certain ancestors become more potent than others. A hidden geography takes shape, and with it the beginnings of myth. Myth in this early sense is not fiction. It is structure. It takes unstable experiences and organizes them into memorable form. The ritual expert becomes one of its main custodians because memory itself is part of power. In non-literate communities, what is remembered well can govern behavior for generations. This matters enormously for the later rise of gods. A god is not just a feeling of unseen presence. A god is a recurring invisible being known through stories, rituals, symbols, and expectations shared beyond one person's private vision. Altered states may therefore help supply the raw material, while collective memory turns that material into durable sacred identity. It is also possible that altered states helped collapse the distinction between human and animal in especially powerful ways. A dancer in antlers, a dream of flight, a vision of becoming prey and predator. At once the felt sensation of leaving the body or entering another form, such experiences could reinforce the idea that human identity is not fixed. In many later traditions, the ritual specialist travels in spirit, transforms into animal companions, or negotiates with masters of game. Again, these comparisons must be used carefully. Paleolithic Europe is not Siberia, the Americas, or Australia. Yet the broad human capacity for symbolic transformation is undeniable, and the archaeological hints fit well enough to keep the possibility alive. None of this means the earliest religious world is organized yet around high gods, moral creators, or celestial kings. That comes later, if it comes at all. The sacred world emerging here is more fluid, more immediate, and more dangerous. It is a world of crossings between dream and waking corpse and ancestor beast, and human cave and open plain sickness and cure vision and social truth. The ritual specialist stands in the middle of those crossings and gives them shape. In doing so, such figures may have become among the first people in history whose authority rests substantially on access to invisible powers. And once that happens, religion can begin to stabilize in new ways. The unseen is no longer merely encountered by chance, it can be sought, managed, performed, shared. A group can gather not only to survive together, but to enter symbolic relation with powers that seem to govern survival itself. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still argue about how much can really be inferred from caves, figurines, and ethnographic analogy. But the broad trajectory is difficult to avoid. As human societies become more symbolically complex, certain people begin acting as bridges to the invisible, and those bridges help turn scattered sacred intuitions into communal systems. For tens of thousands of years that may be enough. Small groups, mobile lives, fluid spirits, animal powers, ancestor presence, ritual specialists charged places, no temples, no cities, no tax-supported priesthoods, no gods with fixed domains written in stone. But then the ground changes. Forest becomes field. Herd movement gives way to fenced animals and stored grain. Seasons are counted more carefully because hunger now depends on the earth behaving on schedule. Villages hold people in one place. Ancestors remain not in memory alone but in land. And under those new conditions the invisible will change with human life. What had once been fluid and roaming may begin to settle, take names, demand offerings, and attach itself to soil, harvest, and walls. The first field does not look like a revolution. It looks small, vulnerable, almost disappointing. A patch of cleared earth, scratched soil, seeds pressed in by hands that have no guarantee of return. A few cut stalks drying near a shelter that is no longer meant to be abandoned next season. Perhaps some animals are penned nearby restless and loud in a way wild herds never are. The old life has not vanished at once. People still hunt, they still gather, they still move sometimes, but the balance is shifting. For countless generations, human beings follow food across the land. Now in a handful of regions at different times they begin asking the land to stay. That request changes everything, including the unseen world. Agriculture is often described as an economic change, and it is certainly that. It alters calories, labourist disease, family size, hierarchy, and settlement. But it is also a spiritual turning point of enormous importance, because it transforms the structure of dependence. A mobile forager depends on many landscapes in sequence. A farmer depends with terrifying intensity on a particular piece of ground, a particular rhythm of rain, a particular timing of flood, frost, pests, and germination. If the old sacred world is fluid spread across animals, caves, ancestors, dreams, and moving seasons, the new one begins to narrow and thicken around place. The field becomes charged, the granary becomes charged, the boundary stone, the house floor, the storage pit, the planted seed, the returning ancestor beneath the village, all of these gather meanings that hunter life did not emphasize in quite the same way. This does not happen because farming people suddenly become more superstitious. It happens because settled life creates new kinds of vulnerability and memory. A foraging band can leave a failing patch of land more easily than a farming village can leave sown fields, wall-stored grain, and buried kin. Once people invest labour in one place season after season, chance becomes heavier. Rain that comes too late is no longer an inconvenience. It is catastrophe. Insects are not a nuisance. They are famine with wings. A field can look healthy for weeks and then fail. A herd animal can sicken and infect the rest. A flood can nourish one year and erase the next. The farmer's world is still natural, but it is now tied to cycles that demand regularity. Sacred life responds by becoming more cyclical, more local, and more insistent. One of the clearest changes is temporal. Foragers notice seasonality, of course. They know migration and ripening with great sophistication. But farmers must formalize time differently because they are managing delayed returns. Seed goes into the ground and disappears. Nothing visible happens for a while. Then shoots emerge and the whole community waits on forces it cannot directly command. This creates a new emotional structure: planting, waiting, hoping, fearing, harvesting, storing, surviving winter, and beginning again. The seed itself becomes a potent symbol because it appears dead and then returns alive in multiplied form. Across many later religious traditions, the analogy between seed and death, burial and rebirth, grain and life becomes almost irresistible. Scholars still debate exactly how early these symbolic connections form, but agriculture gives them extraordinary power. The earth no longer merely receives the dead, it also receives life in hidden form and gives it back. The parallel matters. In earlier burial worlds, the grave already invites questions of transformation. Farming intensifies those questions by making transformation seasonal and visible. Seeds disappear into darkness and return. Fields die to stubble and revive in green. Domestic animals breed in predictable cycles. Villages learn patience in a new way, and patience breeds ritual because waiting invites control through symbol, when control through action is limited. People mark planting times. They bless tools. They observe taboos. They watch the sky with heightened anxiety. They tie communal survival to recurring acts performed at the right moment. Sacred calendars begin to matter more because practical calendars now matter more. Settlement changes memory too. Mobile people remember routes, camps, and significant places. Settled people remember houses, walls, graves beneath floors, old hearths, inherited fields. Ancestors remain present in more literal ways. In several early farming communities, the dead are buried inside or beneath houses, their remains sometimes revisited, handled, or displayed. This is an extraordinary development because it binds kinship property and the unseen into one physical structure. The dead are not somewhere else in a distant burial ground. They are under the floor where people sleep, cook, argue, and raise children. A house becomes not just a shelter, but a layered social body containing living members and dead predecessors together. What survives in the record suggests that in such settings, ancestors may become more fixed, territorial, and politically important than they could be in highly mobile bands. Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, though much later than the first experiments with cultivation, offers one of the most vivid examples of this settled sacred density. Houses cluster closely, people enter from above, burials lie beneath living spaces, walls carry imagery. Animal installations, especially bucrania made from cattle skulls and horns, punctuate interiors with controlled wildness. Scholars still debate much about the site, including how centralized its ritual life really was, yet it shows with unusual force what happens when domestic space ancestry, animal symbolism and repeated occupation combine over generations. The sacred no longer lives only in caves or exceptional places. It enters architecture. It lives in the house itself. This is a profound shift because once sacred power attaches to built environments, religion becomes easier to stabilize and transmit. A cave visited occasionally is powerful, but a house entered daily teaches through repetition. A buried ancestor underfoot shapes behavior every time the floor is crossed. A horned installation on a wall watches all ordinary activities. Sacred life becomes domesticated in one sense and intensified in another. The ordinary and extraordinary mingle constantly. The field feeds the house contains the dead protect or judge the lineage holds the land. Spiritual and economic continuity begin to merge. Agriculture also reshapes gender, labor and fertility in ways that affect religious imagination. This is a subject filled with old myths and modern overcorrections. Earlier scholarship sometimes assumed that early farming everywhere produced goddess worship centered on fertility and Mother Earth. More recent research has become far more cautious, rightly warning against turning every figurine into a universal mother goddess. Many prehistoric figurines remain ambiguous. Some may be toys, ancestors, symbols of status, ritual objects, or something else entirely. The evidence remains incomplete. Even so, agriculture undeniably heightens attention to fertility in a broad sense of women, herds, fields, orchards, and households. Reproduction becomes more visibly tied to wealth, labor, inheritance, and seasonal success. Under those conditions, symbols of generation and abundance can become harder to separate from sacred power. This does not mean the first farmers simply worship fertility as an abstract principle. It means that the realities of sowing, gestation, birth milk, and grain storage all crowd closer together in daily thought. The body and the field begin to mirror one another. The ploughed earth opens and receives. The womb opens and receives. Grain ripens, children grow, animals calve, milk flows or fails. Blood and seed take on wider symbolic resonance because they sit at the center of survival. In later agricultural religions, these analogies become explicit, elaborated into myths of dying and rising gods, divine mothers, sacred marriages, and seasonal rites. The earliest farming worlds may be less systematized, but the raw patterns are already present. There is a lesser-known archaeological detail that fits this transition well early. Farming often does not initially make life easier. In many regions, skeletal evidence suggests that the first agricultural populations become shorter, less healthy, in some respects more vulnerable to disease and more burdened by labor than some earlier foragers. Diet narrows, crowding spreads infection. Social inequality grows. This is important because it means the rise of farming is not an obviously triumphant march that makes the world feel more controllable. In some ways, it does the opposite. It traps communities inside fragile systems of greater productivity and greater risk. Religion in such settings may become more urgent precisely because life is not calmer. The stakes are higher. A failed harvest can destroy a village that has too much invested to move lightly away. That pressure encourages offerings. If survival depends on forces that seem regular yet remain beyond command, then reciprocity becomes an appealing model. One gives to receive, one honors to secure favor, one abstains to prevent offense. In small-scale farming communities, this may begin simply food placed in special locations, libations, selected slaughter, first fruits, household rites. But the logic is powerful and scalable. If the earth feeds the people may feel they owe the earth, the dead, the place, or the unseen beings believed to govern fertility. This is one of the routes by which diffuse sacred feeling can harden into obligation. The gods of later agriculture are often hungry for offerings, because agricultural life itself is structured around exchange dependence and return. There is also a political consequence. Settled life produces surplus, however modest at first, and surplus produces disputes over land storage, inheritance, labor, and rights to ritual roles. Once ancestors are tied to houses and houses to land, the unseen can begin to justify ownership. A lineage that buries its dead in one place claims continuity there. Sacred memory becomes territorial memory. This is a crucial step on the road toward formal religion, because it makes spiritual claims useful in organizing society. A spirit does not merely inhabit the landscape in general. It may now guard this boundary, this field, this household, this water source. The sacred becomes mapped, and still this is only the middle of the transformation. Farming changes the human relationship with time, place, fertility, death, labor, and obligation, but it does not instantly produce full pantheons. For long stretches, early village religion may remain local, ancestor, heavy, animistic, and domestic, rather than centered on grand temple gods. Yet the conditions for such gods are gathering. Permanent structures exist, repeated communal rites exist. Surplus can support specialists. Sacred places can be enlarged. Seasonal cycles can be predicted and formalized. Communities can coordinate belief on a scale beyond one hearth or one burial cluster. The invisible is becoming more organized because human life is becoming more organized. What once moved with the band now settles with the village. What once belonged to caves and extraordinary individuals now enters fields, houses, and annual rites. Invisible powers that were once encountered in scattered ways can now be approached through routine ceremony tied to collective survival. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars continue to debate how uniform this process really was across regions. No single explanation fully accounts for the astonishing diversity of early religion. But what survives in the record suggests a broad truth. Agriculture does not invent the sacred from nothing. It reshapes older sacred instincts into forms that are more local, repetitive, territorial, and institutionally durable. That durability soon leads to something even more surprising. In a few places before full cities dominate the landscape, human communities begin building monumental ritual spaces whose scale exceeds ordinary domestic need. Massive carved pillars rise from the earth. Animals stare from stone. Labor is coordinated on a level once thought impossible for people without states. It starts to look as though worship itself, not kingship, not urban bureaucracy, but shared sacred effort may have helped pull large communities together before civilization fully arrived. And if that is true, then the first great temples do not merely serve complex society. They may help create it. Before there are streets, before there are palaces, before writing fixes laws and kings into durable memory, there is stone rising from a hilltop in southeastern Anatolia. The wind moves over bare ground. Gazelle once pass in huge numbers through this region. Wild grasses cover the slopes in season, and on one elevated place people gather to do something so deliberate and so labor-intensive that it still unsettles modern assumptions about how civilization begins. They quarry limestone. They shape it into massive T-shaped pillars. They haul those pillars into enclosures. They carve animals across their surfaces: foxes, boars, snakes, birds, scorpions, wild creatures alert and dangerous and alive with symbolic force. They build circles or rings that do not look like houses. They return, rebuild, bury, and build again. The site now known as Göbekli Tepe stands at the edge of one of the great turning points in human history, and it forces a difficult question into the story of gods. What if organized worship, or something very close to it, comes before cities and helps call them into being? For a long time the usual sequence seemed obvious. First people settle, then farming intensifies, then surplus accumulates, then leaders emerge, labor is directed, and temples appear as byproducts of social complexity. Religion in that model helps maintain a civilization that already exists. Göbekli Tepe complicates that picture. Dating to the pre-pottery Neolithic, roughly in the 10th to 9th millennia, BCE, it belongs to a world that is early in the agricultural transition and not yet urban in the later Mesopotamian sense. And yet the monumental effort visible there is undeniable. However the labor was organized, people cooperated on a scale well beyond immediate household need. They built not shelter, but symbolic space. That symbolic space matters because it suggests that ritual is not merely decorative. It can be architecturally central. The enclosures at Göbekli Tepe are not casual gathering spots. Their central pillars dominate the space, and some scholars interpret the T-shaped forms as highly stylized beings, perhaps anthropomorphic in some way, especially where arms, hands, belts, and loincloth-like details appear. Whether these are gods in any later sense remains uncertain. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the function of the site. But the pillars do not feel like neutral posts. They feel present. They stand like occupants as much as supports. This may be one of the earliest large-scale examples of human communities constructing a place specifically for encounter with concentrated sacred power. The carvings deepen the impression. The animals are not arranged like simple decoration for beauty alone. Many are dangerous. Many are assertive. They crawl, stalk, or strike across the stone surfaces with the tension that makes the whole site feel less pastoral than charged. If early farming villages are beginning to domesticate the world, Göbekli Tepe refuses domestication in symbolic terms. Wildness dominates its imagery. Foxes, snakes, vultures, boars, aurochs, creatures associated with danger, death, liminality, and power appear again and again. This has led some scholars to suggest that the site preserves a worldview still deeply rooted in older foraging cosmologies, even while communities are moving toward more settled life. That possibility makes the site even more fascinating. It may stand not at the beginning of religion, but at a moment when very old sacred instincts are being monumentalized before they are transformed into later temple systems. This is one reason Göbekli Tepe resists easy classification. Was it a ceremonial center for dispersed groups who gathered seasonally? Was it tied to feasting, mortuary ritual, initiation, or ancestor cult? Was it a place where ritual specialists performed for communities already experimenting with cultivation and settlement? No single explanation fully accounts for all the evidence. The site has produced relatively little sign of ordinary domestic occupation in its earliest monumental phases, which strengthens the case that it is not primarily a village in the usual sense. Instead, it may be a destination, a place people come to for reasons that exceed daily life. That alone is extraordinary. It suggests the sacred can mobilize labor across communities before kings or bureaucracies force such cooperation, and labor on this scale matters. To quarry stone, transport it, carve it, erect it, and repeatedly maintain and bury monumental enclosures requires planning, memory, and social coordination. Some researchers have argued that such gatherings may themselves have encouraged the intensification of food production. Large ritual feasts require food. Food at predictable scale encourages management of plants and animals. In that interpretation, the old phrase might need reversing. First the temple, then the city. Or more cautiously, first large ritual cooperation, then more durable forms of settlement and production. Scholars debate this intensely, and it would be simplistic to say, religion alone created civilization. But Göbekli Tepe makes one thing hard to deny. Shared symbolic worlds are not peripheral to social complexity. They may be among its engines. There is a lesser-known and revealing detail in the site's history. The monumental enclosures were eventually deliberately backfilled, buried with rubble and debris rather than simply abandoned to weather. That choice is one of the strangest features of all. It suggests controlled closure, a structured ending rather than neglect. Why bury something so labor-intensive? Perhaps ritual cycles changed. Perhaps social organization shifted. Perhaps new sacred forms replaced the old. The reason remains uncertain. Yet deliberate burial gives the enclosures a life cycle almost like that of a body or ancestor. They are made used, closed, and entombed. Architecture itself begins behaving like ritual matter. This pattern matters for the rise of gods because it shows sacred space becoming separable from ordinary domestic life, in a way earlier caves only partly anticipated. A cave is found. A monumental sanctuary is made. Once humans begin building places whose main purpose is concentrated ritual presence, they have taken a major step toward later temples and cult centers. Sacred geography is no longer only inherited from landscape, it is constructed, marked, and enlarged by human design. That changes the relationship between people and the unseen. Invisible powers are no longer approached only where nature seems charged. They are invited into built forms given architectural settings, and perhaps embodied in symbolic pillars, carvings, and recurring ceremonial acts. This also changes social authority. Large ritual centers require knowledge how to build, when to gather, what to carve, what to do there, who may enter, who may direct, who remembers the proper sequence. That does not necessarily mean a priestly class in the later institutional sense, but it does imply the concentration of ritual expertise. The sacred becomes something that can be organized on behalf of many. A ritual specialist in a small band may guide a trance or burial. At a monumental ceremonial site, expertise scales upward. Ritual now orders large gatherings, shared memory, and collective labor. The invisible is becoming public, and public religion is different from intimate sacred practice. It does not erase dream burial or household rites, but it adds spectacle architecture and communal identity. A person arriving at a monumental site experiences the sacred not only inwardly, but socially. The stones testify that others believe, others labor, others return. Monumentality persuades. It tells the body that this place matters because it has been made to matter at cost. The larger the structure, the harder it becomes to treat sacred claims as merely private impressions. They are now literally built into the horizon. This may be one reason temples become so enduring across world history. A temple does more than host belief. It stabilizes it. It gathers stories, rituals, offerings, specialists, and memory into one place. Göbekli Tepe may be very early and very different from later temple cities, but it already shows the essential principle. Sacred power can be spatially concentrated, symbolically, materialized, and socially organized beyond the household. Once that becomes possible, gods, or at least godlike beings, have a much easier path into durable existence. A recurring invisible presence linked to a particular built place is far easier to remember, serve, and inherit than a diffuse feeling of mystery in the landscape. Yet caution remains necessary. It is still unclear whether the central beings at Göbekli Tepe should be called deities, ancestors, spirit beings, or something for which no later word is fully adequate. The carvings do not come with captions. The builders left no myths in writing. The temptation to identify the first temple and declare the first gods must be resisted. What survives in the record suggests concentrated sacred architecture, powerful symbolic imagery, and organized ritual life. That is already enough to transform the story. Whether the beings honored there are fully gods or not, the social conditions that will later support gods are becoming unmistakable. This transformation likely extends beyond one site. Across the broader Neolithic world, ritual life becomes more materially visible. Special buildings appear. Ancestor practices continue. Animal symbolism remains potent. Communal gatherings seem to matter. Human groups are learning how to scale sacred experience upward from the grave and the cave to the ceremonial center. And once sacred life reaches that scale, it begins to intersect more directly with the two forces that will define the next phase of religious history: permanent settlement and differentiated social roles. Some people will farm, some will store, some will lead, some will remember, some will mediate the unseen. Under those conditions, diffuse spirits can begin to sharpen into distinct divine personalities. That sharpening is one of the great quiet revolutions in the human imagination. A river spirit and ancestor presence a dangerous place, a force in the storm. These are powerful, but they remain fluid. As villages thicken into proto-towns and social life becomes denser, fluid powers start becoming more legible. They acquire symbols, domains, preferences, perhaps names. They can be invoked more precisely, represented more consistently, and tied to repeated ritual obligations. The world of spirits begins its long transition into a world of gods, and when that happens, the sacred becomes more than a field of presences. It becomes a society of beings, not unlike the human society growing beneath it. Powers are sorted, roles emerge. Some beings govern fertility, others storm death lineage, war protection boundaries, or the sky. The invisible world begins to reflect the visible one with increasing detail. Temples before cities have helped make that possible. They have gathered the community, magnified the unseen, and taught human beings that shared ritual can build worlds out of stone. Soon, in the villages and river valleys where settlement deepens, those worlds will begin to speak with more distinct voices. A power without a name is difficult to summon twice in exactly the same way. It may be felt, feared, or remembered, but it remains unstable, more like weather than law. This is one of the quiet but decisive changes that begins to unfold as villages grow denser and communal life becomes more fixed. The invisible world, once filled with fluid presences tied to caves, animals, dreams, ancestors, storms, and particular places, starts to become more organized. Some powers are no longer approached only as moods in the landscape or fleeting agencies behind uncertain events. They begin to acquire sharper identities. A river is still a river, but it may now also have a being behind it. The storm is not only dangerous weather, but the expression of a specific force. Fertility is not simply the mysterious return of grain and birth, but the domain of a recurring presence who can be invoked, honored, offended, and remembered. This is the long transition in which spirits begin to become gods. It is not a clean transition, and it does not happen everywhere in the same way. In many societies, diffuse spirits, ancestors, local powers, and high gods coexist for thousands of years. Even in the most elaborate ancient civilizations, religion never becomes purely systematic. Sacred life remains crowded and layered. Household spirits persist beside temple gods. Ancestors remain important beside cosmic rulers. Local shrines continue under grand pantheons. Scholars still debate the best way to describe this transformation because the evidence is patchy and the categories are modern. Yet a broad pattern does emerge. As human communities settle, expand and develop more differentiated roles, they begin to prefer invisible beings that can be identified repeatedly. A named power is easier to invoke, easier to teach, easier to bind to ritual, and easier to place within a larger sacred order. Naming matters because names stabilize memory. In a non-literate world, especially, repetition is everything. A presence encountered once in dream or trance may fade into personal mystery. A presence identified again and again across seasons, households, and ceremonies begins to outlive any individual witness. It becomes socially real in a different way. This is how invisible beings acquire durability. They are told, retold, depicted, symbolized, and approached under shared expectations. A community does not merely feel that the earth is somehow alive. It begins to act as though a particular power governs germination, another watches over the dead, another protects the house, another resides in the storm. The sacred field becomes partitioned. This partitioning mirrors changes in human society itself. As villages become more permanent and labor becomes more specialized, human life grows more structured. There are fields and storehouses, households and boundaries, elders and youths, ritual experts and ordinary participants, zones of purity and danger, proper times for sowing and harvest. It is not surprising that the unseen world begins to reflect this increasing differentiation. A more complex society tends to imagine a more organized, supernatural realm. Invisible power is no longer only everywhere. It is somewhere in particular, or responsible for something in particular. The heavens, the underworld, the river, the house, the hearth, the womb, the grain store, the dead, each can now become domains rather than just experiences. One way this likely happens is through repeated ritual association. If a community performs one set of rites before planting and another at burial, different sacred identities can gradually crystallize around those different acts. A power once approached vaguely as life-giving earth may become distinguishable from a power associated with lineage, death, weather, or protection. Over generations, these power acquire traits by accumulation. One is linked to grain, another to cattle, another to flood, another to hilltop shrines, another to the ancestors of a particular lineage. This process does not require philosophers inventing theology from scratch. It can happen through ordinary memory. A power is what people repeatedly do in relation to it. Images accelerate the process. Once a sacred being begins to receive consistent visual treatment, even if highly stylized, its identity becomes easier to preserve. This is one reason anthropomorphic and semi-anthropomorphic representation matters so much in religious history. A force can be feared without being pictured, but picture and symbol help it circulate socially. The T-pillars at Göbekli Tepe may hint at this threshold. Later, figurines carved symbols, animal emblems, masks, and repeated motifs all contribute to it. A being that has a recognizable form, or at least a cluster of recognizable signs, becomes easier to invoke across generations. The mind remembers persons better than abstractions. Once sacred power begins to take person-like shape, religion becomes more narratable. That does not necessarily mean early gods are fully human in appearance. In fact, many likely remain mixed, unstable, or only partly personified for a very long time. They may be represented by animals, horns, posts, stones, trees, masks, or unusual objects rather than by complete human bodies. Some may be imagined as forces with intention rather than as characters with biographies. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars rightly resist forcing later classical ideas of deity onto earlier worlds. But even partial personification matters. The moment a power can prefer, demand, remember, or be angered, it begins to resemble a god more than a mere impersonal force. Agriculture continues to push in this direction because it encourages repeated dependence on specific outcomes. Rain must come, grain must rise, herds must breed, children must survive disease, must pass, stores must last. Under those conditions, the unseen becomes easier to negotiate if it is imagined as social rather than mechanical. Social beings can be persuaded. They can receive gifts. They can be approached with humility or praise. They can be offended and reconciled. This is one reason offerings become so central. The logic of gift and return, already familiar in human relationships, extends into the sacred world. A diffuse force is difficult to bargain with. A being with identity, appetite, and authority can enter exchange. What begins as reverence deepens into obligation. This is also where myth begins to expand rapidly. Once sacred beings acquire stable identities, stories about them can accumulate more easily. A storm power does not merely exist, it does something. A fertility power does not merely bless the field. It withdraws, returns, mourns, mates, fights, descends, rises, protects, punishes. Myth is not decoration added later to finished religion. It is one of the tools by which invisible identities become coherent and memorable. In small-scale societies, myth may remain local, flexible, and orally fluid. It still performs the same essential work. It binds ritual memory and sacred presence into narrative form. A god is not just a power one feels, it is a power one can tell. The surprising thing is how often these emerging gods still carry older layers inside them. A later deity of grain may still bear traces of older earth reverence, ancestor concern, and seed burial symbolism. A sky god may carry memories of storms once approached simply as dangerous agency. A goddess of animals may preserve far older hunting relationships in transformed form. Religious change is rarely replacement. It is usually accumulation. New gods do not erase the cave, the grave, the herd, or the dream. They absorb them. That is why the oldest religious systems often feel so crowded. They are not built fresh on empty ground. They are layered over thousands of years of earlier sacred habits. A lesser known but important point in current scholarship is that the emergence of gods may be connected not only to complexity, but to scale of trust. In very small groups, diffuse spiritual worlds can function because everyone shares immediate relationships and memory. In larger villages and early towns, social coordination becomes harder. Shared gods help widen the circle. If many households honor the same being, participate in the same rites, or gather at the same sanctuary, they gain a symbolic framework larger than kin ties alone. This does not eliminate conflict, but it provides a common language of obligation. A named god can hold together people who are no longer bound only by face-to-face familiarity. In that sense, gods may be as much social technology as metaphysical conclusion, yet they remain emotionally compelling because they answer needs older than society itself. The gods emerging in early settled worlds are not invented only to govern grain taxes or maintain order. They still carry grief, or fear, hunger, and the human refusal to accept a purely indifferent universe. The dead still matter, dreams still matter, animals still matter, storms still terrify, birth still astonishes, illness still arrives from nowhere. The difference is that these experiences are now being interpreted through increasingly stable sacred identities. The invisible has begun to sort itself into recurring persons. No single explanation fully accounts for why some powers become gods, while others remain localized spirits or ancestral presences. Historical contingency matters. Ecology matters. Politics matters. Some communities may never move far toward full personified pantheons. Others may do so quickly under pressure of settlement and exchange. But across several early centers of civilization, the general trajectory is recognizable. The sacred becomes legible enough to organize. A being with a name can have a shrine. A shrine can accumulate offerings. Offerings can support specialists. Specialists can standardize rites. Standardized rites can stabilize belief. At each step, a presence grows less fleeting and more institutional. This institutional potential becomes even more important once leadership and inequality deepen. A named god can bless a boundary, protect a lineage, legitimize a storehouse, or elevate a ritual office above ordinary life. A fluid spirit world is harder to monopolize. A recognizable deity tied to a specific sanctuary or ritual sequence can be managed more effectively by those who control access. That will matter enormously in the next phase of the story, when early states begin to harness the sacred as part of political order. But even before kings fully claim divine backing, the groundwork is being laid. Powers are becoming identifiable, and identifiable powers are easier to align with human hierarchy. Still, this moment should not be imagined as cynical manipulation. That comes later and even then never fully explains belief. The people who participate in this transformation likely experience it as genuine discovery rather than invention. They do not feel they are manufacturing gods for convenience. They feel they are learning who inhabits the world. That distinction matters. Religion is persuasive not because it is merely useful, but because it makes existential sense to those living inside its conditions. A village waiting on rain, protecting grain, burying kin under houses, and returning yearly to the same rites is almost asking for divine personalities to emerge. And once those personalities appear, they begin to reorder more than ritual. They reorder authority itself. A being with a name can prefer one lineage, one sanctuary, one priestly family, one ruler, one city. The sacred world becomes political because human society has become political enough to mirror itself upward. Gods are no longer only powers behind life. They are participants in the structure of collective life. Soon they will guard laws, crown kings, justify wars, and define entire communities. The invisible, once scattered among graves, dreams, beasts, and caves, is becoming a society above society. That is where the ancient world starts to change with new speed. Because once gods can be named, they can be served. Once they can be served, they can be organized. And once they can be organized, the people who stand closest to them, priests, rulers, ritual authorities, can begin turning sacred force into one of the strongest foundations of power the human species has ever known. The god is no longer only in the storm or the seed. The god now has a house, and the house has keepers. Doors, thresholds, storerooms, altars, precinct walls, processions, offerings measured in quantity, rather than impulse festivals tied to calendars, rather than moods of necessity. These changes mark one of the great reorganizations of human life. As villages thicken into towns and the first states begin to appear in river valleys and fertile plains, religion stops being merely one woven strand of communal existence and starts becoming one of the main structures that hold society together. The sacred does not lose its mystery. It gains administration. And administration in human history is never a small thing. This is the world in which kings and priests rise beside one another, sometimes as partners, sometimes as rivals, often as overlapping roles. In earlier sacred worlds, ritual authority may belong to healers, elders, trance specialists, ancestors, or household heads. Now it becomes easier to concentrate. The temple stores grain. The sanctuary receives offerings. The calendar determines feast days and planting cycles. Knowledge of proper ritual sequences becomes valuable, even indispensable. A person who knows what the gods require gains practical power, because the gods are now believed to govern the conditions under which the whole society survives. Rain, flood, fertility, legitimacy, victory, plague, and cosmic stability can all be tied to correct ritual. Once a community accepts that those who mediate between people and gods stop being peripheral figures, they become central managers of reality itself. Mesopotamia offers one of the clearest early examples, though not the only one. In the southern alluvial plains, where irrigation fragile river behavior, surplus production, and growing settlements reshape life temples, emerge not as decorative shrines, but as institutions embedded in the economy. They own land coordinate labor, receive offerings, and stand at the center of urban identity. The city is not just a dense population center, it is the dwelling place of a patron deity. The god belongs to the city, and the city belongs to the god. This is a profound shift from earlier sacred landscapes. Invisible power is no longer simply encountered or petitioned. It is housed, represented, administered, and politically anchored. That anchoring helps explain why ancient gods often look so much like ancient societies magnified. They have households, attendants, rivalries, preferences, territories, and hierarchies. This is not because humans cynically invent them as copies of government, though political utility certainly grows. It is because once divine beings become stable enough to organize collective life, they inevitably begin to mirror the forms of life they organize. A farming society imagines agricultural deities. A city imagines patron gods' walls under divine protection and cosmic order expressed through ranked offices. A kingdom imagines divine kingship or kings chosen by heaven. The invisible reflects the visible not because it is false, but because human beings can only build sacred order through the materials of social experience already available to them. Priests emerge here with new weight because memory itself has become institutional. In a small ritual community, everyone may know enough. In a large settlement, exactness matters differently. Which day is proper, which words are proper, which offering is sufficient, which impurity must be removed, which shrine belongs to which power, which procession route renews the city, which omens are favourable. The priestly role gathers around this need for precision and continuity. A priest is not merely a believer with status. A priest is a custodian of procedure. This matters because procedure stabilizes belief. A god served the same way in the same place, at the same time with the same symbols, becomes more enduring than a god approached only through scattered acts of awe. Egypt provides another variation on the same deep pattern. There too the sacred and political become inseparable, though in a distinct style. The Nile's regularity, the scale of the floodplain, and the extraordinary symbolic coherence of Egyptian civilization produce a vision in which divine order, kingship, death, and cosmic balance intertwine. The pharaoh is not just favored by the gods. He embodies a unique relation to them, sustaining Mayat the principle of order, justice, and rightness that keeps the world from slipping back into chaos. Here the divine does not only govern harvest and household, it governs reality on a cosmic and state level. The king's authority is religious, and religion is political in the deepest possible sense. To obey the sacred order is to inhabit society correctly, What is striking is how ancient and durable some of the underlying patterns remain even inside these complex systems. Egypt's grand temples elaborate mortuary rituals, and divine kingship may seem worlds away from Paleolithic burials and cave sanctuaries, yet the continuities are real. Death still matters intensely. The body still requires careful treatment. Ancestors, or at least the honoured dead, remain powerful. Animals still carry sacred force in ways that defy purely symbolic reduction. The difference is that these elements now exist inside a formal order, supported by monumental architecture, writing, taxation, and state labour. The sacred has scaled upward without losing its older emotional roots. This scaling changes morality as well. In very early sacred worlds, obligations may be local and situational honour. The dead respect the hunt, avoid offence, keep ritual order. In state societies, divine expectations can become broader and more explicit. The gods witness contracts, punish transgression, protect social rank, and authorize legal structure. This does not mean ancient religion suddenly becomes ethical in the modern sense, nor that morality begins only with states. Humans had norms long before temples managed grain. But gods now become more visible as guarantors of public order. Oaths matter because gods hear them. Justice matters because divine balance underlies the kingdom. Even where law is not handed down directly by a single deity, sacred order still frames legitimacy. A lesser-known but revealing feature of early temple systems is how materially practical they are. Temples often function as economic centers, warehouses, employers, redistributors, and places where records are kept. This is not a corruption of religion from some earlier pure form. It is one of the reasons religion becomes so powerful. A deity with a temple is not just spiritually important. The deity's household is woven into the material life of the community. Offerings feed priests and workers. Land attached to sanctuaries supports cult activity. Festivals reorganize labor and reinforce collective identity. The divine becomes administratively real. When people bring grain to the temple, divine obligation and economic obligation become harder to separate. This fusion has enormous consequences for hierarchy. Once sacred systems are embedded in institutions, unequal access to the divine becomes easier to maintain. Certain families hold priestly offices. Certain rulers sponsor temples and gain prestige. Certain cities elevate their patron deities above rivals. Certain rituals are restricted. Knowledge becomes guarded. The unseen, once experienced widely through dreams, caves, burials, and ordinary ritual life is now increasingly filtered through authorized channels. Household religion persists, but public religion develops gates. Power gathers where access narrows, yet the relationship between rulers and priests is rarely simple. In some societies, rulers dominate temple systems. In others, priesthoods can become entrenched powers of their own. Sometimes the king is the chief priest. Sometimes he depends on priests to certify his legitimacy. Sometimes sacred authority restrains political ambition. Sometimes it amplifies it. Scholars still debate the balance of these forces in different early civilizations because institutions changed over time. What survives in the record suggests constant negotiation rather than a single model, but everywhere the pattern is clear enough once gods are tied to public order. No ruler can afford to ignore them, and no ritual system can remain entirely outside politics. This is also the era when divine images gain sharper public significance. Statues, cult object standards, ceremonial dress, temple reliefs, and formal iconography make the god visible in repeatable ways. The image is not merely art. It can be treated as a locus of presence, fed, dressed, carried, hidden, awakened, or purified. That treatment reveals something important about the maturation of gods in human history. A sacred being becomes most stable not only when named, but when materially represented in a form a community can approach together. The image does not replace the god, it anchors interaction. It gives ritual somewhere to land. Writing strengthens all of this. Once hymns, offerings, dedications, myths, and ritual instructions can be recorded, the divine personality becomes even more durable. Stories standardize, titles accumulate, genealogies of gods become easier to preserve. Priestly knowledge can be taught with greater continuity. A god can now exist not only in memory and symbol, but in text. This is a revolution in religious persistence. The invisible acquires archives. It becomes much harder for a deity to vanish completely when administrators, poets, and temple workers are all reproducing its presence in signs that outlast speech. And yet for all this increased order, the human reasons for needing gods remain painfully familiar. Crops still fail, children still die, floods still overwhelm, plague still moves invisibly through streets, kings still lose wars, bodies still decay, the temple and the palace promise order, but the world remains unstable. That instability is part of what keeps religion central. If society were truly controllable, the gods might shrink. Instead, the early states are powerful, yet fragile, capable of astonishing coordination and sudden collapse. Divine order therefore becomes not a luxury but a shield against chaos. People bring offerings because they are not secure. Kings invoke heaven because their rule is never absolute. Priests preserve ritual because disorder is always near. No single explanation fully accounts for the rise of gods into instruments of power, because belief, fear, wonder, and administration are all braided together. It would be too cynical to say religion becomes only a tool of elites. It would be too naive to deny that elites benefit immensely from it. The truth is more human and more complicated. People genuinely believe the gods sustain the world, and those beliefs genuinely help sustain institutions. Sacred order is both experienced and used. That dual reality runs through nearly every civilization that follows. By this stage, the invention of gods has crossed a threshold. Gods are no longer only emergent persons within local ritual life. They are public powers around which labor law, kingship, and urban identity can be organized. The temple stands over the storehouse. The ruler stands before the altar. The priest speaks what must be done. The city imagines itself under divine protection, and its enemies under divine threat. Religion has become one of the main architectures of civilization, but this architecture does not rise everywhere in the same form. Mesopotamia is not Egypt. Egypt is not the Indus world. Early China is not the same as either. Across the ancient world, different landscapes, political structures, and inherited sacred habits produce different answers to the same deep human problem. How should invisible power be imagined? Who speaks for it? What does it want? And does the path from spirits to gods always lead in the same direction? The answer, as the earliest civilizations make clear, is no. There is no single beginning, no single divine template, and no single way humans learned to people the unseen. The river valley is not a script with one ending. It is several experiments unfolding at once under different skies, on different soils, among people carrying different memories of the unseen. This matters because the story of gods is often told too neatly, as if humanity passes through one universal sequence from fear to ritual, from ritual to temples, from temples to pantheons, and from pantheons to moral religion. The archaeological and historical record does not support such simplicity. What survives in the record suggests repeated patterns, yes, but also striking divergence. Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus region, Early China, Mesoamerica much later, and countless smaller traditions all develop sacred worlds that solve similar problems in very different ways. Humans may share certain cognitive tendencies and existential pressures, but no single explanation fully accounts for how gods emerge. There are many beginnings, and many of them remain only partly visible. Mesopotamia gives one version of the story: unstable rivers, vulnerable irrigation expanding cities, competing polities, temple economies, and gods who often resemble magnified urban powers. The divine there can be intimate and terrifying at once, tied to specific cities yet participating in larger cosmic dramas. Egyptian religion gives another version a more unified flood system, a stronger emphasis on divine kingship, extraordinary concern with death and continuity, and a sacred order that feels at once cosmic, political, and deeply conservative. The gods of Egypt are not simply Egyptian copies of Mesopotamian deities. They arise from a different ecology, a different political shape, and a different way of imagining permanence. The same broad human species facing mortality and dependence produces distinct divine worlds because environments and institutions change the form belief takes. The Indus civilization presents one of the most tantalizing examples precisely because it refuses to speak clearly enough for certainty. Urban planning, drainage, standardized weights, craft production, long-distance exchange, and dense settlement all point to an impressive level of social coordination in the 3rd millennium BCE. Yet the script remains undeciphered, and without readable text, the inner logic of Indus religion stays frustratingly elusive. Seals show animals' hybrid-looking motifs, and human or quasi-human figures whose meanings remain disputed. Some older interpretations eagerly projected later Hindu deities backward into the Indus world, identifying proto-Shiva figures or mother goddesses with more confidence than the evidence justified. More cautious scholarship has pulled back from those claims. The evidence remains incomplete. Still, the Indus case is profoundly instructive because it shows that a complex urban civilization can leave behind abundant material traces and yet keep its gods largely hidden from us. Complexity does not always yield transparency. That silence is useful. It warns against treating the rise of gods as a process always tied to the same visible markers. Monumental temples, written myths, royal claims, and carved divine genealogies make some traditions easier to reconstruct than others. Where those are absent or unreadable, religion may still be central while remaining archaeologically restrained, or encoded in forms we do not fully understand. The Indus world may have had household cults, civic rituals, ancestor traditions, water symbolism, fertility concerns, or powerful deities, but the balance among these remains uncertain. Scholars still debate how centralized its ritual life was, whether certain buildings had sacred functions, and how strongly political authority depended on overt divine imagery. That uncertainty matters because it reminds us that gods can emerge in ways that do not always leave the same signature. Early China offers yet another path. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, under the Shang ancestor veneration and high divine power appear in a configuration quite unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt. The oracle bone inscriptions reveal a world in which royal ancestors, ritual, communication, divination, and the high god Di or Shangdi interact in a structured but distinctive hierarchy. Here the dead remain politically active in a direct way. Ancestors do not fade into household memory alone. They mediate between ruler and higher divine power, influencing warfare, harvest weather, childbirth, illness, and court decisions. This is an extraordinary arrangement because it shows the sacred world organized less as a simple pantheon of natural forces and more as an extension of lineage and royal authority into the invisible. The dead, far from being an archaic survival beneath more developed religion, remain central at the top. This complicates any story in which ancestors come first and gods replace them later. In some civilizations, ancestor cult and divine cult never separate cleanly. The dead remain politically potent, ritually indispensable, and structurally intertwined with higher powers. That pattern may have very deep roots reaching back toward the burial worlds of prehistory, though the Shang form is highly developed and court-centered. What matters is the lesson. The invention of gods is not always a move away from the ancestors. Sometimes it is a reorganization in which ancestors and gods become parts of one vertical sacred order. The invisible society above mirrors the visible one below with startling precision. It is tempting at this point to look for the universal cause beneath all these variations. Was it agriculture? Was it kingship? Was it cognitive bias? Was it fear of death? Was it the need for social cohesion? Each answer catches part of the truth and misses part of it. Agriculture clearly matters because it intensifies dependence on cycles and place. Political hierarchy matters because public cult scales with institutions. Cognitive tendencies matter because humans are primed to detect agency and remember social beings. Death matters because no society escapes grief. But none of these alone explains why one tradition emphasizes divine kingship, another city gods, another royal ancestors, another household ritual, another mountain spirits, another morally charged cosmic principles. Shared humanity produces recurring religious themes, not identical results. Lesser-known comparisons make the diversity even more striking. In some early societies, water becomes the great sacred medium not only as practical necessity, but as purifier boundary and source of hidden life. In others, mountains dominate as axes between worlds. Elsewhere, the sky's regularity and the movements of celestial bodies drive sacred calendars and political legitimacy with exceptional force. Some traditions imagine gods with family structures that resemble aristocratic households. Others focus more on diffuse powers, taboo, and ritual propriety than on strongly personified deities. Even where full gods emerge, they may remain unstable, absorbing local spirits, ancestors, and foreign cults as societies interact. Religious history is less like a straight road and more like a delta branching, rejoining, and shifting course with the terrain. This diversity also warns against one of the oldest habits in the study of religion, assuming that societies become more advanced as their gods become more abstract, ethical, or centralized. That evolutionary model once dominated scholarship, and traces of it still linger. It tended to portray hunting peoples as trapped in animism, farmers as devoted to fertility cults, early states as polytheistic, and later empires as rising toward higher religion. The real record is far messier. Animistic orientations persist within complex civilizations. Ethical concerns appear early. High gods can coexist with innumerable local spirits. Monotheistic or philosophical tendencies can arise without erasing older ritual layers. Human religious life does not climb a single ladder, it accumulates, and accumulation has consequences. A Mesopotamian city may honor its patron deity while households maintain ancestors and protective spirits. An Egyptian temple system may coexist with local cults, sacred animals, and personal devotions. A Shang king may divine through ancestors while also addressing higher powers beyond them. The sacred world in most ancient societies is therefore not an elegant theological system, but a crowded ecosystem. This may be one reason gods prove so adaptable. They do not have to erase earlier beliefs. They can absorb them, dominate them, or sit above them. The same civilization can contain very old burial instincts, very local place spirits, and highly formalized state cult all at once. This layered quality is especially important because it shows that religion is not simply imposed from above. States can sponsor gods, codify rites, and monumentalize divine order, but people continue to approach the unseen through illness, family household protection, fertility dreams, and the memory of the dead. A god supported by a temple may be grand, but the need for that god still touches daily vulnerability. This is one reason elite and popular religion so often overlap without being identical. Priests and rulers may articulate cosmic order, but ordinary people still want help with childbirth sickness, cattle, bad weather, and haunting grief. The divine survives because it speaks at both scales. The question of when humans invent gods therefore becomes harder, not easier, as the evidence broadens. There is no single first answer waiting in Mesopotamia, Egypt, or any one cradle of civilization. By the time written history begins, gods are already old. They arrive in texts with layers behind them, older place cults, older ancestor rites, older fears, older sacred geographies, older animal powers. Even the earliest written deities are not first inventions, they are already descendants. The true beginnings lie deeper, scattered across prehistory, where ore burial, dream trance settlement, and ritual cooperation slowly prepare the conditions under which divine persons can emerge. And because those conditions emerge in different combinations, the resulting gods differ too. Some are creators, some kings, some patrons, some judges, some ancestors, enlarged, some natural powers, made social, some local guardians, some cosmic abstractions wearing personal form. What joins them is not a single origin story, but a shared function within human life. They render the invisible legible enough to live with. They make death, weather, fortune, authority, and fertility speak in voices communities can remember. That may be the deepest unity beneath all the diversity, yet even that is only part of the answer. Gods do not survive for millennia merely because they explain the world. They survive because they help people endure it. A storm can be measured eventually. A drought can be analyzed. But the emotional life of uncertainty remains. Suffering still needs meaning. Loss still needs a frame. Community still needs glue stronger than convenience. The sacred world answers those needs in different cultural languages, but the human pressures beneath them are remarkably persistent. So when the great ancient civilizations appear each with its own divine order, they do not settle the question of origin. They widen it. They show that gods are not one invention, but many related inventions, or perhaps better, many emergences shaped by local conditions and very old human habits. The evidence remains incomplete, especially where scripts are silent or undeciphered. Scholars still debate what counts as a god, when personification becomes decisive, and how much continuity really exists between prehistoric sacred life and historic pantheons. But the overall lesson is clear enough. Humanity does not invent gods once. It invents them repeatedly differently, and for reasons that overlap without ever being identical. And beneath all those differences remains the same older puzzle first felt under open sky and beside the dead. Why does a symbolic species again and again fill the unseen with persons? Why do invisible beings become so compelling, so durable, so socially useful, and so emotionally necessary? To answer that, it is no longer enough to compare civilizations. The story must turn inward and ask what these inventions do for the human mind itself, how they help people survive fear, uncertainty, cooperation, and the unbearable fact that chance governs so much of life. A child falls sick in the night and no one can say why. The fever comes without warning, the skin burns, breathing changes. The small body that was laughing that morning is now distant behind the eyes somewhere unreachable by touch alone. In another house, grain, stored carefully through the season, begins to rot. Elsewhere, a storm breaks too early or not at all. A hunter slips and dies on familiar ground. A woman survives childbirth once and not the next time. A strong man wastes away for reasons no one can see. The world is full of patterns, but it is also full of violence that feels patternless, and that may be one of the deepest reasons humans return to gods again and again. Gods do not merely explain the world in the abstract. They make its uncertainty social. They turn accident into intention, suffering into relationship, and survival into something more than luck. This is one of the strongest explanations modern scholarship offers for the persistence of religion. Human beings are exceptionally poor at enduring pure randomness, especially when the stakes are high. A bad harvest hurts, but a bad harvest with no explanation is harder to carry. A death caused by offended ancestors, divine judgment, neglected ritual, hostile spirits, or cosmic imbalance is still tragic, but it belongs to a structure. Something can be done in response. A sacrifice can be offered. A taboo can be repaired. A prayer can be made. A diviner can be consulted. Even when the explanation is painful, the pain is no longer mute. It has entered a world of causes. Scholars still debate exactly how religion first took shape, but few doubt that it helps human communities metabolize uncertainty by embedding it in meaning. This does not mean religion is simply a comfort blanket laid over ignorance. That old dismissal misses both its emotional force and its practical effects. A world interpreted through gods can change behavior in ways that are socially useful, even when the metaphysics are unprovable. Shared rituals during crisis reduce panic. Mourning practices prevent grief from atomizing a community. Sacrifice and feasting redistribute resources. Taboos can regulate behavior. Sacred calendars coordinate labor. Divination, even when inaccurate in empirical terms, can force decisions that otherwise paralyze a group. Religion does not survive because it is merely false consolation. It survives because it organizes action, feeling, and memory under pressure. One major line of explanation in anthropology and cognitive science begins with agency detection, the old human tendency to assume that events have intentional causes. This tendency is often exaggerated in dangerous environments because false positives are cheaper than false negatives. Better to mistake the wind for a predator than the predator for the wind. Applied more broadly, the same mental habit can encourage belief in invisible watchers, purposeful storms, offended dead, or protective powers. A world full of uncertain events starts to look inhabited. This theory explains part of why supernatural belief arises so readily, but by itself it is not enough. Many false positives never become gods. To become religion agency must be remembered, narrated, and shared. The mind supplies the spark. Society supplies the firewood. Another explanation emphasizes theory of mind, the human ability to imagine what other beings know, want, and intend. This ability is essential for social life, but it easily extends beyond visible humans. People can imagine what an ancestor might want, what a river spirit might dislike, what a sky god might observe, what a dead relative still remembers. In this way, gods become cognitively natural because they are built out of the same mental architecture used for ordinary social relations. They are not alien to thought. They are intensified social beings. Invisible, yes, but still legible in terms of intention, preference, anger, reward, and memory. This may be one reason they are easier to remember than abstract principles. A god is in part a superhuman person. That idea leads into another influential theory: gods as monitors of behavior. In small, face-to-face groups, reputation travels quickly, and cooperation can be enforced through direct observation. In larger communities, anonymous cheating becomes easier. Shared belief in moralizing or watchful supernatural beings may help extend trust beyond immediate kin. If people believe someone always sees even when no human witness is present, cooperation can become more stable at scale. This hypothesis has gained attention because it links religion to one of the hardest problems in human social evolution: how to maintain order among people who are not close relatives and may never meet again. Scholars still debate how early, strongly moralizing gods appear, and whether such gods are a cause or consequence of larger societies. The evidence suggests the relationship goes both ways. Big societies encourage big gods, and big gods can help hold big societies together. Yet this explanation also has limits. Many early gods are powerful without being especially moral in the later ethical sense. They care about sacrifice, purity, status, proper ritual, and loyalty more than universal justice. That does not make them socially irrelevant. It simply shows that religion can stabilize cooperation long before it becomes centered on conscience, as modern people often understand it. Fear of divine punishment may discourage some behaviors. So may the belief that ancestors observe the house that oaths bind under sacred witness, or that impurity threatens the whole group. The sacred does not need to preach equality to regulate conduct. It only needs to make actions feel cosmically consequential. There is also the problem of grief. Gods and spirits help people survive loss not by removing it, but by extending relationship beyond biological finality. A dead child still belongs somewhere. A dead parent is still reachable in ritual, memory, dream, or offering. Burial is not abandonment, but passage. Even where no fully developed afterlife doctrine exists, the simple sense that the dead remain socially real can make mourning bearable in a way that pure extinction does not. Modern grief often reveals this ancient instinct despite secular frameworks. People still speak to the dead, dream of them, keep their objects close, search for signs, and feel their presence in rooms they once occupied. Religion formalizes what grief does spontaneously. It gives absence shape. A lesser-known but important thread in current research concerns control. Humans cope better with stress when they feel they can do something, even if that action does not materially alter the outcome in a direct way. Ritual provides exactly this kind of perceived control. Under conditions of unpredictability, storms, illness, travel, war planting, childbirth ritual can lower anxiety by replacing helpless waiting with structured action. Say these words, make this offering, observe this fast, wear this amulet, walk this route, bury the dead this way. The action matters psychologically even before one asks whether it matters supernaturally. It tells the body and the group that uncertainty has a procedure. That is not trivial. It may be one of religion's most powerful survival functions. There is also beauty in it, and beauty should not be underestimated. Humans do not only cling to gods because they fear death or need social control. They also find meaning in grandeur pattern song, procession, sacred architecture, and the feeling of belonging to something larger than the self. The same species that dreads chaos also seeks transcendence. A ritual can be comforting and elevating at once. A god can be feared and loved at once. Sacred stories can explain the world while also making it feel more vivid, more inhabited and more morally charged. Awe remains part of the picture all the way through. Even the most organized religions keep a trace of the old Ice Age night, when the stars themselves seem too ordered to be accidental and too distant to be intimate. One reason no single explanation fully accounts for gods is that different explanations may dominate in different contexts. In times of famine, religion may function as collective endurance. In large states, it may stabilize hierarchy and trust. In households, it may protect births, marriages, and the dead. In ritual specialists, it may crystallize visionary experience. In rulers, it may legitimize power. In artists, it may give form to wonder. In ordinary people, it may do all of these at once. The invention of gods is not one solution to one problem. It is a flexible bundle of solutions to many enduring human problems, which is exactly why it proves so resilient. This resilience is especially visible when one compares religion to other explanatory systems. A practical technique can fail and be abandoned. A political arrangement can collapse. A crop can fail in one valley and succeed in another. But gods can absorb failure in ways human institutions often cannot. If rain does not come, perhaps the ritual was flawed, the offering insufficient, the community impure, the timing wrong, the deity angered, the omen misread. This adaptability can make religion frustrating to skeptics and powerful to believers. It bends without breaking easily. Gods remain useful because they are not pinned to one test alone. They sit inside the whole interpretive fabric of life. There is, of course, a harder edge to this. A world explained through gods can also intensify fear, blame, and coercion. If suffering is meaningful, someone may be at fault. If divine order must be maintained, deviation becomes dangerous. If a god favors one people, outsiders may become threats not only politically but cosmically. Religion consoles, but it can also accuse. It binds communities, but it can also divide them. These consequences do not mean gods are cynical inventions. They mean that once invisible power becomes socially real, it enters the whole field of human conflict and need. The sacred amplifies what humans already are. Perhaps the deepest explanation of all is this: gods endure because human beings are social creatures trying to survive in a world that is not socially obligated to them. Storms do not care. Disease does not negotiate. Death does not ask permission. Crops do not grow because they are deserved. The universe, insofar as it can be seen, directly offers pattern without sympathy. Gods change that. They make reality answerable. Even when the answer is harsh, it is still an answer. A god may punish, but punishment implies recognition. An impersonal universe does not punish. It simply proceeds. For many humans across most of history, that is the more intolerable possibility. So when asking why humans invent gods for survival, the answer is not simply that gods feed the hungry or heal the sick. Often they do not. The answer is that gods make hunger, sickness, fortune, and death part of a negotiable world rather than a silent one. They transform existence from exposure into relationship. That transformation can comfort, discipline, unite, terrify, and inspire. It can justify kings and console widows. It can organize cities and steady a single frightened mind beside a sickbed. Few inventions in human history operate across so many scales at once, and yet for all their usefulness, the gods remain elusive in origin. Theories can explain why such beings are cognitively plausible, socially advantageous, emotionally sustaining, or politically effective. But none of those theories can point to one grave, one cave, one harvest field, or one sanctuary and say, with certainty, here at this moment humans crossed from awe into deity. The evidence is too scattered, the meanings too layered, the categories too modern. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is part of the story. Because the gods, for all their power, emerge from human life gradually enough that their beginnings are almost always hidden by the very beliefs they help create. To understand that hiddenness, it is necessary to confront the frustrating truth at the center of the whole question. The deeper we go, the less the record speaks clearly. We have bones, ochre carvings, pillars, figurines, graves, seals, temple walls, and later texts filled with already ancient divinities. but the first inner step the moment a human being not only feels awe, but treats an unseen presence as real enough to remember and serve may never be fully recoverable. The evidence fails us just where the mystery becomes most intimate. The first true believer leaves almost no trace. That may be the most unsettling part of the whole search. The person who first feels that a dream is not merely a dream, that a dead parent still listens, that a painted chamber changes the quality of the world that a storm carries will that a hidden force behind the harvest can be approached like a presence that person vanishes almost completely into prehistory. No inscription records the moment. No priest writes it down. No witness explains what was meant in words we can still read. Archaeology gives us aftermath instead. Ochre in graves, beasts on cave walls, carved pillars, sealed symbols, houses built above ancestors, temples rising beside storehouses, gods arriving in texts already clothed in titles and rituals. The beginnings themselves remain obscured, and that obscurity is not accidental. Religion takes shape in precisely the domain that fossilizes worst inner experience, shared assumption, remembered gesture, and meanings so obvious to those living them that no one thinks to explain them. This is why scholars are so careful when they speak about the origins of gods. The evidence remains incomplete, not as a polite disclaimer, but as a brutal methodological fact. A burial may imply belief, but it does not tell us belief's exact form. A figurine may represent a deity, an ancestor, a toy, a ritual object, or several things at once. A cave image may belong to hunting rites, myth, initiation, trance memory, or some combination now impossible to reconstruct. Even later written sources can mislead because the first gods we can read about are never the first gods humans believed in. They are the survivors of long prior histories. By the time a deity enters text, it has almost certainly already absorbed centuries or millennia of older sacred habits. This gap between trace and meaning creates one of the hardest problems in prehistoric interpretation. Modern people are trained to ask direct questions. What does this object mean? Which god is this? What belief does this burial prove? But ancient sacred life often refuses such clean categorization. Belief is not always proposition before it is practice. A community may perform acts for generations without defining them in the tidy abstract language scholars later prefer. A gesture can be sacred before anyone states a doctrine behind it. A place can be feared before anyone names the being associated with it. A burial can imply continuity after death without yielding a clear map of the afterlife. In this sense, the earliest religion may be less like theology, and more like atmosphere made durable by repetition. That is difficult for evidence to catch. Archaeology is good at recovering repeated acts. It is weaker at recovering the assumptions that made those acts feel necessary. If bodies are buried in similar ways again and again, one can infer that death is culturally structured. If pigments recur, one can infer symbolism. If monumental ritual buildings appear, one can infer concentrated sacred effort. But inference has limits. Scholars still debate, for example, whether some Neanderthal and early modern human burials reflect explicit belief in spirits or simply a widening social concern for the dead. They debate whether figurines conventionally called fertility idols truly represent goddesses, or whether that label says more about modern expectations than ancient reality. They debate the meaning of animal-rich imagery in caves and ceremonial centers because the same image can support multiple plausible readings. This uncertainty is not a flaw to be repaired by more confidence. It is part of the intellectual honesty the subject requires. Older scholarship often leapt too quickly, especially when religions seem to offer grand universal stories. Every female figurine became a mother goddess. Every horned image became a deity. Every burial good became proof of a fully articulated afterlife. Much of that has been revised, sometimes sharply. The caution is healthy. Yet it also creates frustration because caution can feel like silence, and the human mind dislikes silence around mystery. We want the first gods to stand still long enough to be identified. The record refuses. One reason it refuses is that the boundary between spirit, ancestor, force, and God is itself unstable. Modern categories sharpen distinctions that ancient people may not have recognized in the same way. Is an ancestor who protects a lineage but also demands offerings a spirit or a god? Is the powerful presence in a mountain a place spirit or a deity? Is a river treated as a being without full human form less divine than a sky power with a personal name? Scholars use terms such as animism, ancestor worship, polytheism, or personified force to create order, and those terms can be useful. But the lived reality may have been blurrier. The invisible world in early societies was likely not divided into the neat taxonomies later historians prefer. It may have felt crowded, layered, and continuous. In such a world, asking when spirits become gods can sometimes be like asking when twilight becomes night. That metaphor matters because the origin of gods may not be a threshold crossed once, but a long deepening of shadow. First there is awe, then the dead remain socially present, then certain places become charged, then animals carry more than animal power. Then ritual specialists begin navigating altered states. Then villages settle and bind invisible forces to land and ancestors. Then communal rituals scale upward. Then specific powers become easier to invoke, depict, and remember. At each step, the unseen grows more structured, yet no single step is decisive enough to isolate as the invention itself. The evidence shows emergence much more clearly than rupture. There is a lesser-known but revealing problem in archaeology sometimes called equifinality, the fact that different processes can leave similar traces. A body buried with objects might indicate belief in an afterlife, or display of status or affection, or custom not fully reducible to any one motive. A special building might be ceremonial, political, communal, or all three. A carved figure might represent a being, a role, a memory, or a tale. This matters because religion rarely operates alone. It intertwines with kinship, economy, display authority, and emotion. The temple is not only sacred, it is social. The grave is not only theological, it is familial. The figurine is not only symbolic, it is material culture in lived hands. Any attempt to isolate religion from the rest of life risks misunderstanding both, and yet complete skepticism solves nothing. If one refuses all inference because certainty is impossible, then the record becomes a mute heap of artifacts, and that too is false. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. They do not build monumental enclosures, bury children with painstaking care, revisit underground painted chambers, or place the dead beneath house floors without symbolic worlds taking shape around those acts. The challenge is to say enough without saying too much. What survives in the record suggests sacred life of great antiquity, great diversity and increasing structure over time. It suggests that by the time literate civilizations describe their gods, the roots of divine thinking already reach back tens of thousands of years. It also suggests that many details of those roots will remain unrecoverable. That irrecoverability may itself explain why so many theories of origin compete so fiercely. When evidence is partial, explanatory models rush in to fill the dark. Some emphasize cognition. Others stress ecology, burial trance, agriculture, inequality, or social cooperation. Each model highlights genuine patterns. Each also risks becoming too total if applied alone. Theories are strongest when they illuminate one part of the emergence without pretending to dissolve the whole mystery. Gods likely endure because they answer many needs at once. Their beginnings are similarly overdetermined. Fear matters, grief matters, dream matters, social scale matters, ritual experts matter, monuments matter, agriculture matters. None of these by itself is enough. Together they begin to look like the human condition under prehistoric and ancient pressure. There is also the issue of survival bias. The gods we know best are often the ones attached to durable states writing systems and monuments. Mesopotamian deities survive in clay tablets. Egyptian gods survive on temple walls and tombs. Shang ritual worlds survive in oracle bones. Countless other sacred beings do not survive because the societies that honoured them left fewer records or because their records decayed. This distorts perception. It can make state gods seem more fundamental than they really are. In truth, the invisible populations that shaped most human lives were probably local, shifting, household-based, place-based, and orally remembered. The great gods of civilization may be the visible peaks of a much larger sacred landscape now mostly lost. That loss should not be imagined only as tragedy. It also protects some humility. There is value in knowing that the first divine worlds cannot be fully domesticated by modern scholarship. They remain partly outside recovery, much as they were once partly outside ordinary explanation for the people who lived within them. The mystery is historical, but it is also methodological. We're trying to reconstruct how vanished minds filled vanished nights with presence. Some of that can be done, some of it cannot. And still, even without full certainty, a pattern emerges clearly enough to matter. Human beings did not wake one morning and decide in a coldly strategic sense to invent gods. They entered gods gradually by living in ways that made the unseen socially real. Death required continuity. Dreams blurred absence. Animals radiated power. Landscapes acquired charged places. Ritual turned fear into practice. Settlement tied sacred meaning to land. Monuments intensified collective belief. States organized the invisible into public order. Every stage added density. By the time divine names are fixed in hymn and law, the world has been filling with presences for a very long time, so the evidence fails, but not completely. It fails us on exact dates, first names, first doctrines, first certainty. It does not fail us on the larger truth. The invention of gods is older than civilization, older than writing, older perhaps than farming, and rooted in capacities that are deeply human: symbol memory, grief, imagination, cooperation, and the stubborn refusal to let the world remain only what it appears to be on the surface. That is not a final answer. It is the nearest shape the evidence allows. And once that shape is visible, another realization follows almost immediately. Whether or not the first gods can ever be identified, precisely their consequences can. Gods changed how humans buried, obeyed, ruled, feared, sacrificed, hoped, and belonged. They did not remain ideas at the edge of life. They entered law, kingship, war, morality, art, and identity with astonishing force. The mystery of origin leads directly into the reality of consequence, because even if the first god can never be named, the invention itself became one of the most powerful and transformative forces the species ever produced. Once the gods enter history in full, they do not remain in the background. They begin shaping the visible world with a force out of all proportion to their invisibility. They organize calendars and crowns, boundaries and bloodlines, harvests and wars. They sanctify marriage, burial law, kingship, rebellion, punishment and mercy. They bless cities and curse enemies. They demand grain, incense, animals, labor and occasionally human lives. They inspire music, architecture, sculpture, poetry, pilgrimage, fasting, ecstasy, terror and obedience. However dim their beginnings may be in prehistory, their consequences become unmistakable. Gods are not merely one idea among many. They become one of the great engines by which human beings reorder themselves. This is the point at which the question of invention becomes inseparable from the question of power. A god once imagined as present does not stay abstract for long. Presence invites ritual. Ritual invites structure. Structure invites institutions. Institutions invite hierarchy. And hierarchy, once cloaked in sacred inevitability, becomes much harder to challenge. This does not mean religion is only a mask for power. It means that any force capable of commanding ultimate meaning will inevitably be drawn into the struggle over who may rule, who must obey, who belongs, who is pure, and what kind of world is considered legitimate. The gods become dangerous in exactly the proportion that they become useful. One of their most enduring achievements is the creation of moral worlds larger than immediate self-interest. This should not be exaggerated into the claim that morality begins with religion. Humans had empathy, reciprocity, kin obligation, and norm enforcement long before temples and law codes. But gods often widen the radius of moral concern and intensify the consequences of moral failure. If oaths are taken before divine witnesses, then lying becomes more than practical betrayal. If the dead are judged, then conduct matters beyond the moment. If cosmic order is tied to justice, then human law becomes anchored in something greater than one ruler's convenience, even where ancient moral systems remain unequal or harsh. The basic move is significant behavior is placed under invisible scrutiny and made cosmically consequential. This matters because it changes how communities imagine themselves. A village can survive on custom. A kingdom needs stronger glue. Shared gods provide part of that glue by turning social order into sacred order. The laws are not just rules. They participate in the structure of reality. The king is not merely strong. He stands under heaven, beside heaven, or through heaven. The city is not merely fortified. It is chosen, watched, perhaps loved by its patron power. This can create solidarity at remarkable scale. People who will never meet can still imagine themselves held within the same sacred frame. That may be one of the reasons religion proves so effective in building large collective identities long before modern nationalism. But the same mechanism carries a darker edge. If one community belongs under one god, another community may become not simply different but wrong. A rival city is not only politically threatening, it is under a rival sacred order. An enemy king is not just a competitor, he is an affront to divine legitimacy. Sacred identity intensifies conflict because it lifts ordinary disputes into cosmic significance. War becomes more than struggle over land or tribute. It becomes purification, destiny, punishment, or the settling of divine claims. Ancient inscriptions are full of such language, and later history will amplify it even further. Gods can unify a people with extraordinary force precisely because they can divide peoples with equal force. Sacrifice reveals this dual nature with particular clarity. In many societies, sacrifice is often described as primitive cruelty or irrational expenditure. Yet from inside the logic of ancient religions, sacrifice is far more coherent. If the world is sustained by relationships with higher powers, and if those powers give fertility, victory, protection, or order, then giving back becomes not waste but reciprocity. Food, blood, smoke, song, labour first. Fruits, even prized animals, become vehicles of exchange. Sacrifice turns dependence into enacted acknowledgement. It also creates visible hierarchy, because what is offered by whom, and in what setting, reveals the structure of society itself. Still, sacrifice can escalate in troubling ways because the more serious the crisis, the greater the pressure to prove sincerity. When crops fail, when enemies close in, when plague spreads, ordinary offerings may feel insufficient. More costly gifts seem more persuasive. This is one reason some societies move at times toward extreme forms of sacrifice, including human sacrifice, though the practice is historically uneven and often exaggerated in popular imagination. Scholars rightly caution against turning all ancient religion into blood spectacle. Many traditions rely mostly on grain drink incense, animal offerings, or symbolic substitutes, yet the underlying logic is revealing. Once the gods are believed to hold life in their hands, humans can feel compelled to pay in life. The moral power of religion can thus tip into moral horror without ceasing to feel sacred to those performing it. The gods also change how humans experience suffering. A death becomes fate, punishment, trial, transition, or sacrifice rather than mere event. A drought becomes judgment, imbalance, or divine withdrawal. A triumph becomes blessing. A child's survival becomes favor. The world grows narratively dense. For many people, this is profoundly stabilizing. Meaning makes endurance possible. But it also means that suffering is rarely left alone. Someone may be blamed, some ritual omission may be suspected, some impurity may need purging. Gods console, but they also interpret, and interpretation can wound as easily as it heals. A lesser-known but important consequence of religion is its role in storing time. Sacred calendars, festivals, genealogies, and commemorative rites preserve collective memory across generations. They tell a people not only how to act, but when to remember and what to remember. A harvest festival recalls dependence, a mourning rite recalls the dead, a New Year ritual recalls cosmic renewal, a king's enthronement recalls divine order. Religion in this sense becomes one of the earliest and most effective memory technologies ever developed. Long before widespread literacy, it teaches the community how to carry the past forward through repeated emotionally charged acts. That alone gives the gods enormous staying power. They return on schedule. The arts flourish under this pressure. Temples, hymns, statues, myths, painted tombs, carved reliefs, sacred dances, chants, processions, amulets, masks, and ritual clothing all become ways of making the invisible sensible. It is easy to talk about religion as control and forget its creative force. Yet some of humanity's most astonishing achievements arise precisely because people believe the unseen deserves beauty, permanence, and form. The same conviction that can justify hierarchy can also build cathedrals of stone in every era, compose songs that outlive kingdoms, and fill blank walls with visions of order stronger than death. Gods are culturally productive because they make meaning matter enough to build for. They also shape the self in quieter ways. To live under gods is to live with observers no human eye can escape. That can produce guilt, discipline, humility, terror, consolation, or inner division. A person learns to examine motives, intentions, and impurity in light of standards not reducible to immediate consequences. This interiorization deepens over time in some traditions more than others, but the roots are ancient. Once invisible powers are believed to watch not only action but inward disposition. The human mind becomes a more crowded place. The sacred moves from cave and temple into conscience. No single explanation fully accounts for why this invention changes humanity so deeply, but part of the answer lies in scale. Gods operate simultaneously at the level of empire and the level of one frightened individual. A ruler uses divine legitimacy to govern thousands. A parent uses prayer to survive one night beside a feverish child. A city offers sacrifices for rain. An old woman leaves food for the dead. The same sacred system can encompass cosmic order and private grief without feeling inconsistent. Very few human institutions can stretch that far. Religion can because it translates vast uncertainty into relationships manageable at every scale, and yet the consequences are never only external. Once humans imagine gods, they also imagine themselves differently. They're no longer simply clever animals surviving in landscapes. They become creatures answerable to unseen judgment, capable of pollution or sanctity, members of chosen peoples, descendants of divine ancestors, bearers of souls, subjects of destiny, or caretakers of cosmic order. The species acquires elevated and dangerous stories about itself. Some of those stories produce compassion and restraint. Others produce exclusion and conquest. Most produce mixtures of both. The gods enlarge human significance, but enlarged significance is not always gentle. By this point in the story, the invention of gods can be seen for what it is: not a minor symbolic habit, but a turning point in the architecture of civilization. Gods help create communities beyond kin, justify rule, beyond force, bind law to cosmic order, attach identity to ritual, and make death bearable enough for societies to continue. They also help sanctify violence, inequality, and fear. They are among humanity's greatest acts of imagination and among the most consequential. To ask when they were invented is therefore also to ask when human beings began reshaping reality through invisible authority on a massive scale. The answer, imperfect as ever, seems to be that this began very early and deepened slowly. But once it crossed a certain threshold, there was no simple return. A people with gods can forget one deity and invent another. It can lose temples and build new ones. It can change myth, merge pantheons, exalt one god over many, or deny old images while keeping older religious instincts alive beneath new language. What it rarely does is return to a purely disenchanted existence. The mind that has learned to treat the unseen as socially real does not easily unlearn the habit. The forms change, the impulse remains. That is why the legacy of ancient gods does not end in antiquity. Their first names may vanish, their statues may topple, their shrines may be buried, but the structures they taught the human mind endure. The search for hidden agency, the need for sacred time, the social power of shared ritual, the hunger for justice beyond human law, the refusal to let death be merely biological, the urge to people, the silence with presence. None of that stays in the ancient world. The old gods change shape, but the patterns remain. And those patterns are still with us, lodged so deeply in human thought that even the modern world, for all its science and light, continues to live in their shadow. The old gods rarely die cleanly. They fade, merge, hide, split, travel under new names, or survive in gestures no one notices anymore. A shrine falls, but the hill remains sacred. A pantheon is replaced, but the calendar still turns around. Feast days first shaped thousands of years earlier. A single god triumphs over many, yet angels, saints, spirits, ancestors, demons, miracles, relics, sacred mountains, holy rivers, and haunted thresholds continue to crowd the unseen. A modern city rises over buried temples and forgotten graves, and still people lower their voices in certain rooms. Still they search the sky in grief. Still they ask what watches, what judges, what remains after the body is still. The invention of gods may belong to prehistory, but its structures remain threaded through the present with astonishing persistence. This may be the most revealing answer of all to the question of when humans invented gods. Not because the date can finally be fixed, but because the invention never remained in the past. It became part of the human operating system. Even in societies that become more secular, more technical, more committed to natural explanations, the old religious habits of mind continue to surface in altered forms. People still search for signs in coincidence. They still speak to the dead. They still feel that certain places are charged. They still invent rituals under stress. They still elevate moral principles into something sacred, inviolable, almost beyond argument. They still divide time into ordinary days and days that feel marked. They still build monuments to memory and approach them with something close to reverence. The gods may vanish in name, yet many of the mental and social structures that once sustained them survive with remarkable strength. That continuity does not mean nothing changes. It changes enormously. Philosophical religion, monotheism, skepticism, science, secular law, and modern psychology all transform how invisible power is imagined or denied. The storm no longer requires a sky god to explain its movement. Disease need not be read as divine displeasure. Crop failure can be understood through climate, soil, insects, and economics, rather than ritual insufficiency. The dead can be mourned within naturalistic frameworks. The visible world in many domains has been explained with unprecedented power. But explanation is not the same as existential replacement. A thunderstorm described by physics may still inspire awe. A death described biologically may still feel metaphysically unfinished. A moral law justified philosophically may still be spoken of as sacred. The human need for significance does not disappear just because mechanisms become clearer. This is why scholars who study religion increasingly resist the old idea that gods belong to a primitive stage of thought, outgrown by modernity. That model was always too simple. Religion is not just a failed science. It is also a language of grief order, dependence, beauty, fear, memory, and belonging. When one form weakens, those needs do not vanish. They reorganize. In some societies they remain explicitly religious. In others they migrate into politics, nationhood, ideology, celebrity, conspiracy, spirituality without institution, or the sacralization of personal identity and moral cause. Human beings continue to create zones of ultimate concern. They continue to people them with forces, watchers, destinies, and unquestionable values. The names change. The deep pattern does not. There is something both humbling and unsettling in that. It suggests that the first gods are not simply inventions imposed from outside by cunning priests or frightened villagers. They are expressions of what happens when a highly social, symbolic, death-aware species tries to live inside an unstable world without accepting instability as the final word. The human mind reaches for presence behind events, order behind suffering, continuity behind death, and judgment beyond immediate power. Sometimes this produces temples and pantheons. Sometimes it produces universal moral law. Sometimes it produces quiet, private rituals performed by people who claim not to believe in anything supernatural at all. What survives in the record suggests that once these habits took root, they became very difficult to erase entirely. That persistence may be clearest in how humans still respond to death. Modern medicine can delay, diagnose, and explain death in ways ancient people could not imagine. Yet the emotional shape of bereavement remains stubbornly old. People still keep objects of the dead. They still visit graves. They still dream encounters and wake shaken. They still struggle to reduce a person to a body that has stopped. Some speak of presence without fully believing in spirits. Others reject formal religion, and yet still feel that love cannot simply end in matter. This does not prove any theology. It proves something more relevant to the history of gods. The ancient pressures that first populated the unseen are still active. Grief continues to make pure disappearance feel inadequate. The same is true of awe. Science has not banished awe. In some ways, it has widened it. The age of stars, the scale of the cosmos, the depth of evolutionary time, the complexity of consciousness, the precarious rarity of life, these can intensify the same emotional response once directed toward moonrise over an ice age plain. The difference is that awe no longer always leads to gods, but it still marks experiences as larger than ordinary use. it still creates the feeling that the world contains more than immediate human purposes can hold. In that sense, awe remains one of the oldest religious emotions even when it no longer wears overtly religious clothing. Modern societies also preserve the sacred through ritual even when ritual is emptied of formal theology. National ceremonies, memorials, court oaths, moments of silence, pilgrimages to graves and monuments, even the choreography of weddings and funerals show how deeply humans still rely on repeated symbolic acts to structure meaning. Ritual did not disappear when some people stopped naming gods. It remained because ritual answers needs older than any one creed. It gives form to transitions. It allows communities to feel themselves existing together in time. It makes invisible commitments visible. These are ancient functions, and they continue with surprising force. There is a final irony in all this. Humans invented gods, if invention is the right word, to make sense of a world that often felt unstable and alive with hidden power. But once gods existed, they changed the humans who believed in them so thoroughly that later generations came to feel the gods had always been there waiting to be discovered rather than made. That reversal may be one of religion's greatest triumphs. The created becomes creator. The imagined watcher becomes the source of imagination. The social being projected into the sky or underworld returns as lawgiver, judge, parent, or origin. In that sense, the invention of gods becomes self-concealing. It buries its own beginnings beneath the authority it creates. Perhaps that is why the question remains so compelling. To ask when humans invented gods is to ask when they began constructing realities larger than biology, realities strong enough to govern empires, console mourners, justify wars, inspire art, and outlive the languages that first named them. The answer cannot be one date or one place. It is a long emergence from burial and dream animal power and cave darkness, harvest anxiety and temple stone ancestral memory and political order. It begins before writing and never entirely ends. Every age inherits the pattern and reshapes it. So the first gods are lost, but their descendants are everywhere, in laws that still retain sacred weight, in ceremonies that still feel untouchable, in the instinct to speak of some values as holy, some places as cursed, some moments as blessed, some deaths as meaningful beyond biology, in the fear that someone sees, in the hope that someone does, in the old human refusal to believe that the visible world is all there is, and that may be the closest thing this long search can reach as a conclusion. Humans invent gods very early, very slowly, and never only once. They invent them wherever death becomes unbearable, without continuity, wherever chance becomes unbearable, without pattern, wherever society grows large enough to need invisible witnesses, and wherever awe becomes too deep to remain just a feeling. The names differ, the forms differ, the evidence breaks and thins the farther back we go, but the shape of the process remains visible. The gods are one of humanity's oldest answers to living consciously in a world it can neither fully predict nor fully accept. The fire burns lower, the painted wall fades back into stone, the grave fills, the seed disappears into earth, the pillar rises, the temple opens its door, the king lifts his offering, the mourner whispers to the dead. The modern city glows over buried sanctuaries, and still the same species looks upward, inward, and beyond the visible, asking what presence moves behind the surface of things. Long before history, that question was enough to begin changing the world. It has never really stopped. The night sky over the ancient camp is still there, though now it is dimmed by cities, satellites, and electric light. The cave is still there too, breathing cold air from the earth. Buried beneath fields and roads are old houses, old floors, old bones, old offerings. the remains of people who once stood where we stand and felt the same unease before death, the same astonishment before birth, the same need to believe that the world contains more than accident. Time has taken their names, their voices, their certainties. It has left only fragments, a stain of ochre, a carved pillar, a handprint on stone. But from those fragments a pattern still rises quiet and persistent. It suggests that the first gods were not born in a single revelation. They gathered slowly in the dark spaces of human life, in dreams where the dead returned, in graves where absence refused to feel complete, in animals that seemed to carry a force beyond flesh, in the seed buried in earth that came back green, in the storm that arrived with too much intention, the sky that moved with too much order, the silence after loss that seemed too full to be empty. Little by little, the unseen became inhabited, and once it was inhabited, human life changed, not all at once, not cleanly, but permanently. The world became a place of watchers and witnesses of sacred times and forbidden acts of promises made before powers no one could see. It became heavier with meaning and more crowded with memory. Even now, after science, after empires, after the fall of countless temples, that old crowding has not entirely gone away. Perhaps it never will. Perhaps the invention of gods tells us less about ancient error than about the enduring structure of human consciousness itself. We are creatures who remember the dead, who fear randomness, who build stories against silence, who turn places into thresholds and moments into rituals. We are creatures who keep looking for presence even when we say we are not. That habit has built civilizations, justified cruelty, inspired beauty, and comforted grief. It has done all of these at once. So the question lingers not because it can be solved perfectly, but because it points to something permanent. Somewhere in the deep human past, long before any scripture people began to feel that the visible world was only the surface of reality, they lived accordingly. And from that decision or that instinct or that necessity, gods began to emerge. Then the fire sank lower. The stars went on turning overhead. The people slept. The dead remained where they were placed. The seeds waited in the ground. And in the long dark between one age and the next, the first invisible beings continued to gather shape in the human mind until they were strong enough to outlast the worlds that made them.